The Mckinley case begins in the soft, warm air of Pensacola, with a young mother's name resting on the top page of the file, and tonight you sit beside it as though the paper has only just been placed beneath your hands. Let the room go quiet, because this story moves slowly, and nothing in it asks you to hurry. We begin with Tonya Etheridge Mckinley, with the streets she knew, with the years that folded over her case, and with the patient work that finally gave investigators a name after a very long silence. You can picture the first folder if you like, a plain folder with softened corners, its tab handled by more than one detective over more than one season. Inside, the pages hold Pensacola in the first days of January 1985, when the air near the Gulf could feel mild even in winter, and porch lights could leave small yellow pools on quiet streets. The Mckinley case did not begin as a famous mystery and a set of details that would wait for science to catch up with them. Tonya was 23 years old then, young enough that many people still remembered her as a girl, and old enough to have a small life already filled with duties, friends, routines, and a child who needed her. When you turn the first page, you notice how ordinary the setting is, and that ordinariness matters. It's easy, years later, to let a cold case become only a name and a date, but at the beginning there was the sound of tires on familiar roads, the faint smell of cigarette smoke in bars and cars, the creak of screen doors, and the low hum of a city carrying on. In the Mckinley case, the first investigators worked with what they had in 1985, and that meant notebooks, interviews, photographs, careful collections, and many hours of asking the same questions in slightly different ways. You can almost hear the soft clack of a typewriter in an office nearby, or the buzz of a fluorescent light over a desk where someone stayed later than planned. The evidence was handled, bagged, labeled, and stored, not because anyone could see the future clearly, but because careful people had learned that the smallest things sometimes matter later. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because cold cases are often solved by people who are not present at the beginning. A patrol officer writes a line neatly. A crime scene technician seals an item without knowing what it may become. A detective puts a report in the right place. Then another detective, many years later, opens the same folder and feels the faint drag of old paper under the thumb. The file waits, and if you're sitting with it tonight, you can feel that waiting as part of the story. The public facts of Tonya Mckinley's case are spare, and we should treat that spareness with care. She was found in Pensacola in early January of 1985, and investigators understood that she had been harmed. They preserved evidence from the scene, followed leads, and looked for the person responsible, though the answers did not come in those first weeks. The case became one of those quiet burdens a department carries, not always in the headlines, but in drawers, in memory, and in the private resolve of people who don't like leaving a family without an answer. You turn another page now, and the paper feels a little cooler, as though the file has been kept for years in a room where the air conditioning ran too strongly. There are names in the reports, and places and times when someone said they saw something, or thought they remembered something, or wanted to help, but only had a small piece to offer. In a patient investigation, those small pieces are not dismissed. They are placed down gently, one beside another, even when they don't yet make a picture. In 1985, forensic science had limits that feel very different from what we know now. DNA was not yet the everyday investigative tool it would become, and detectives could not simply send a sample away and expect a profile to return with family trees, distant matches, and narrowing branches. They had fingerprints, hair comparisons, blood typing, witness statements, timelines, and the practiced instinct of people who spent their days listening for inconsistency. Sometimes that was enough. In the Mckinley case, it wasn't enough yet, so the investigation moved as many investigations move at first, through doors, through phone calls, through long conversations in plain rooms. You can imagine a detective sitting across from someone at a table, a pen resting near a legal pad, coffee cooling in a paper cup until it tasted flat and bitter. The questions would have been practical. When did you last see Tonya? Who was she with? What did she say? Did anything feel unusual? The rhythm is humble, almost repetitive, but that repetition is the sound of people trying. The early days of a case have their own weather. There is urgency among investigators, but not the kind of urgency we need to borrow tonight. For us, looking back softly, it's enough to notice how many people must have been searching their memory, turning over the same evening in their minds, wondering whether an ordinary moment had held some important detail. A parked car, a voice, a place on the road, a person leaving earlier than expected. These are the little stones a detective gathers, even when the path is still hidden. But as the first weeks became months, the Mckinley case began to enter the long, difficult middle of a cold investigation, where the file remains open, though the world outside keeps changing. You can feel the change in the file when you move from the earliest reports into the later ones. The ink becomes a little less urgent, the dates spread out, and the same names appear with more space between them. In Pensacola, the seasons kept arriving in their usual way, with humid afternoons, rain shining on pavement, and winter mornings that still carried a coastal softness. For Tonya's family, though, time could not have felt ordinary, because every year added itself to a question no one had answered. When a case grows cold, it does not mean it is forgotten. That is one of the first gentle corrections we make as we sit with the Mckinley case tonight. Cold can mean the leads have thinned. Cold can mean a witness moved away, a phone number changed, a suspect could not be tied to the evidence, or a theory could not carry its own weight. But cold does not always mean still. Sometimes it means waiting inside a box, with its labels intact, until the right method finally exists. You can picture the evidence room as a place of quiet order, with shelves holding the unfinished work of many years. There might be cardboard boxes with black marker on the side, envelopes sealed with tape that has yellowed at the edges, and plastic sleeves that make a faint rasping sound when handled. The air might smell of dust, paper, and old adhesive. Nothing there is dramatic, it is only careful. But careful is often what survives. The Mckinley case depended on that survival. Somewhere in the physical record, there was biological evidence that remained important long after the first investigation had slowed. In the 1980s, it may have been understood only in a broad way, something that could support a case if a suspect were already known. Decades later, it would become something else, a small silent witness that could be read with tools the first investigators did not yet have. That is one of the patient truths of old detective work. The people at the beginning may not solve the case, but they can protect the future of it. They can write the date clearly. They can keep the chain of custody. They can resist the temptation to discard what seems useless. They can believe quietly that tomorrow may know how to ask a better question than today. As you sit with the file, that belief feels almost tender. Years passed. A city changed around the case. Cars became rounder and quieter. Computers appeared on desks where typewriters had once sat. Records that had been kept in cabinets began to be entered into systems, and laboratories learned to read smaller and smaller traces. Tonya's name remained in the old file, and the Mckinley case remained part of Pensacola's unfinished work. One more reminder that a person's life cannot be reduced to a closing date on a report. There is a human weight to that kind of waiting. You can feel it in the pauses between updates, in the way a detective might remember a case while driving home under streetlights, or while hearing another family ask the same kind of question. Police departments are made of procedures, but they are also made of people, and people carry certain names longer than they expect. Tonya Mckinley's name was one of those names. Sometimes, in the long middle of a cold case, nothing visible happens for years, and yet the case is still being preserved by attention. A file is not misplaced, evidence is not destroyed. A later detective reads the old work with respect rather than impatience. You can imagine someone lifting the box from a shelf, feeling its weight settle into both hands, and knowing that inside it is not only paperwork, but a family's long wait. Then, as forensic science changed, the Mckinley case entered a different kind of time, one where old evidence could be asked new questions, and where the answer might come not from a confession or a fresh witness, but from the quiet language of DNA. When we turn into the DNA years of the Mckinley case, the room around the file seems to change. The paper is still there, the old reports still carry the marks of 1985, but now there are lab forms, database references, and the clean, careful vocabulary of genetic comparison. You might imagine a different kind of desk, with a computer screen glowing blue-white in a dim office, and a technician reading numbers that would have meant nothing to the earliest detectives. DNA testing did not arrive all at once as a miracle. It came in stages, with early methods, then stronger methods, then databases, then new ways of comparing profiles and building leads. For many cold cases, the first important step was simply realizing that preserved evidence might still contain a usable profile. That realization required money, time, permission, and someone willing to reopen a case that had already waited too long. In Tonya Mckinley's case, investigators eventually had a profile from evidence connected to the crime. That profile did not immediately solve everything by itself. You can think of it as a key without a visible door, precise and powerful, but still waiting for the right lock. Traditional DNA databases could help only if the person responsible, or a very close match under the right rules, was already there. If not, the profile remained important, but quiet. This is where genetic genealogy entered the story, and we should move through it gently, because it is patient work dressed in modern clothing. It is not a single button pressed in a bright room. It is hours of looking at distant relatives, family lines, birth records, marriages, obituaries, addresses, and names that branch outward like winter trees on paper. You, as the detective tonight, follow those branches slowly, not with excitement, but with care. Parabon Nanolabs and Genetic Genealogy CC Moore's team became part of the Mckinley investigation, helping law enforcement use genetic genealogy to search for a possible identity behind the DNA. The method looks for relatives who share pieces of genetic information, then asks how those relatives might connect through family history. It is quiet, detailed work. It smells less like dust than like printer paper and coffee, but it belongs to the same old tradition of patient detectives comparing one fact with another. You can imagine the genealogist's desk late in the evening. There are census records, public family trees, names written on a pad, and lines drawn between people who never knew they would one day help explain an old case. The work is both technical and deeply human, because every branch of a tree is made of marriages, moves, children, losses, second chances, and ordinary lives. Somewhere in that ordinary web, investigators hoped to find the man whose DNA had waited in the Mckinley file. The process would have narrowed possibilities, perhaps first to a family, then to a smaller set of men, then to one name that deserved closer attention. That is how these cases often move, not from darkness to certainty in a single motion, but from a wide field into a smaller circle. The circle tightens through dates, locations, ages, opportunity, and finally direct comparison. It is slow enough that you can hear the pen moving across the page. The name that emerged was Daniel Leonard Wells. Investigators still needed confirmation, because genealogy can point, but a criminal case needs firmer ground. So the work returned from family trees to evidence, from possibility to comparison. Authorities obtained DNA from a discarded cigarette associated with Wells, and that sample was compared with the evidence preserved from Tonya's case. The match gave investigators what the old file had been waiting to say. Even here, we keep the tone low. There is no need to make a sharp sound out of it. A match in a cold case is not only a moment of discovery, it is also the closing of a long distance between 1985 and 2020, between a sealed item and a modern laboratory, between a family's waiting and a name spoken aloud. In the Mckinley case, the distance had been measured not just in years, but in patience. But before that name could become part of a courtroom story, investigators had to do the old work again. The careful work that has always belonged to detectives, no matter how modern the science becomes. That meant returning to addresses, habits, and names, because even a strong scientific lead has to be placed inside the ordinary geography of a life. You can imagine a detective looking at Daniel Leonard Wells not as an abstract entry in a database, but as a person who had once moved through Pensacola's streets at the same time Tonya Mckinley was living her young life. The old city becomes important again, with its low roofs, its winter dampness, its familiar roads, and the soft scrape of paper maps replaced by digital searches on a screen. The question was no longer only who might fit the evidence, it was how that person belonged to the world around the file. Investigators had to be sure the timeline could hold. In a case this old, even certainty has to walk carefully. You look at ages, locations, known connections, prior addresses, and the shape of a person's life in 1985. Then you compare those things to what the evidence has begun to say. It is patient work, and it resists shortcuts. The DNA may bring the name closer, but the detectives still have to ask whether that name can stand under the weight of the case, in a courtroom, under cross-examination, and in front of a family that has waited too long for something more than a theory. There is a quiet dignity in that part of the investigation. No one gets to lean only on a feeling. No one gets to hurry because the answer seems near. You can hear the low murmur of offices, the clicking of keyboards, the sigh of a chair rolling back from a desk, and perhaps the distant ring of a phone that has nothing to do with this case at all. Life continues around the work. The Mckinley file sits open under the light, and the page waits for each careful notation. When detectives looked more closely at Wells, the modern lead began to align with the old evidence. That alignment matters because cold cases are sometimes full of names that nearly fit, stories that almost connect, and memories that seem promising until they soften under review. In Tonya Mckinley's case, the preserved evidence and the genetic comparison gave investigators a firmer path than they had possessed before. You can imagine the atmosphere changing in small ways, not with a loud announcement, but with people leaning closer to the same table. A name had come into focus after years of silence. The arrest came in 2020, decades after Tonya was found, and long after the first investigators had done what they could with the tools of their time. By then, many details of the world had changed beyond recognition. Phones no longer hung on kitchen walls the same way. Photographs no longer waited inside envelopes from drugstores. Police files could travel through systems that did not exist when the first report was written. Yet the heart of the Mckinley case had not changed. A young woman had been taken from her life, and people who cared about her still needed the truth to be treated carefully. You can sit with the image of that arrest as part of the file, but not as a triumphant ending. In a case like this, the moment is complicated. For investigators, it can bring relief, validation, and the heavy knowledge that so many years passed first. For family, it can bring an answer and a wound reopening at the same time. For the public, it may sound like a solved mystery, but for the people closest to Tonya, it was never only a mystery. It was a name spoken at home, a life remembered, and an absence that had been carried through birthdays, holidays, and quiet ordinary mornings. The old records would not have known, back in 1985, that they were waiting for 2020. They would not have known the name Parabon, or genetic genealogy, or the shape of the family trees that would one day be built from partial matches. They only knew how to remain. A label stayed legible, a sealed item stayed sealed, a report stayed attached to the right file. You, turning the page tonight, can feel how modest those acts seem, and how much they eventually meant. In that sense, the Mckinley case belongs to a larger story of patient detective work, where time does not only erode a case, but sometimes makes room for the tools that can finally read it. Time takes witnesses away, blurs memories, and changes neighborhoods, and we should never pretend otherwise. But time can also bring databases, better laboratories, more careful methods, and a generation of investigators trained to look again at what their predecessors preserved. The same years that made the case harder also made its answer more possible. You might pause here with the evidence folder half open, listening to the quiet around you. There is a particular sound that old paper makes when it is moved after years in storage, a dry whisper, almost like a leaf pressed inside a book. That sound belongs to many cold cases. It belongs to boxes lifted from shelves, to envelopes slit open by gloved hands, to photographs laid flat beneath a lamp. It belongs to the patience of people who know that not every answer arrives in the first season, or even the first decade. The detectives who first worked Tonya's case were doing a different kind of job than the people who later solved it, but both kinds of work mattered. The first group had to preserve, document, interview, and hold the scene together as best they could. The later group had to reinterpret, test, compare, and search through records that reached beyond Pensacola into family connections and public archives. You can feel the two eras meeting inside the same file, not as rivals, but as hands passing a fragile object from one table to another. And when that fragile object arrived in the age of genetic genealogy, the case began to breathe differently, because old evidence could finally speak in a language that investigators understood. The language of genetic genealogy is precise, but the work around it can feel almost domestic. You look for grandparents, cousins, siblings, marriages, and moves from one place to another. You follow a name through birth announcements, cemetery records, census lines, and faded yearbook entries. You study family connections the way an archivist studies a fragile letter, with care for what is known and humility about what is missing. In the Mckinley case, this kind of work turned DNA from a profile into a direction, and then from a direction into a name. You can imagine the genealogist tracing a match back through shared ancestors, moving gently from one branch to another. On the desk, there may be a cup with a ring of cold coffee at the bottom, a notebook filled with arrows, and a screen showing records that once sat in courthouses and library drawers. The work is modern, but it has an old feeling. It asks you to be patient with spelling changes, second marriages, missed records, and the ordinary confusion of human families. Nothing about it is rushed. There is also an ethical seriousness in this work. A name in a family tree is not an accusation. A shared segment of DNA is not a final answer. Investigators must move carefully, because every branch contains people who did nothing wrong and may know nothing about the case that has brought detectives to their distant family line. As you sit with the Mckinley file, you can feel how important that restraint is. The search is not only for the right name, it is also a search conducted among living people, with privacy, grief, and uncertainty close by. That is why confirmatory testing matters so much. When Wells became a focus, investigators did not simply stop at the genealogy. They needed a direct comparison, a clean link between a sample associated with him and the evidence from Tonya's case. The discarded cigarette became part of that step. You can imagine it handled not with drama, but with sterile packaging, paperwork, and the faint tackiness of a label pressed onto a bag. A small item, easily overlooked in any other setting, became important because the file had waited for the right question. The comparison reportedly linked Wells to the DNA evidence in the Mckinley case. That sentence can sound simple when spoken plainly, but inside it are decades of stored evidence, laboratory development, family reconstruction, legal review, and careful police work. You may feel the weight of it more if you slow down. The sample had to exist. The sample had to survive. The sample had to be suitable for testing. The right people had to decide to test it again, and the right methods had to be available when they did. This is how some cold cases are solved, not by one great flash, but by a line of quiet decisions. Someone saves the evidence. Someone reopens the file. Someone applies for funding or requests testing, or asks whether new methods might help. Someone compares a result against a database, then someone else builds a tree branch by branch. A detective reads the report, then checks the timeline, then seeks the confirmatory sample. The answer arrives only because so many small acts did not fail. In a sleep story, we don't need to hurry through those acts. We can let them sit beside us. You can hear the hum of a lab refrigerator, the soft snap of gloves, the printer warming before it releases a page. You can see the neat black letters of a report and the clean white margins around them. A case that once belonged to the streets and late-night interviews now also belongs to sterile rooms, database searches, and people trained to read patterns too small for the eye. Yet the heart of the work remains human. The lab report does not grieve. The database does not remember Tonya as a mother, a daughter, a friend. People do that. People carry the file into meetings, call the family, answer questions, and prepare for legal steps. People decide how to speak gently when the news is heavy. In the Mckinley case, the science gave investigators a name, but the meaning of that name belonged to the people who had waited. When an arrest happens after so many years, the old case becomes present again. Reporters call. Former neighbors hear the name on the news. People who were young in 1985 are older now, and some may have to reach back through memory to find where they were when they first learned about Tonya. You can imagine a kitchen table somewhere, with the television low and a hand resting still beside a cup. The past does not return loudly in such moments. It often returns quietly, with a familiar name spoken in a different voice. For investigators, the arrest also meant preparing the case for court. That preparation would require more than the DNA result. Prosecutors would need the full history, the chain of custody, the old reports, the lab work, and any surrounding evidence that helped make sense of the charge. You can imagine binders being assembled, copies made, timelines reviewed, and older documents examined for clarity. The file that had once waited in storage now had to stand upright in the bright, formal light of legal proceedings. This is another place where patience matters. Old cases bring old problems. Witnesses may be gone. Memories may be fragile. Procedures from decades past must be explained in the terms of their own time. Investigators have to show not only what the evidence says now, but how it traveled safely from then to now. You can hear the careful language of chain of custody, the inventory numbers, the signatures, the dates, and the small procedural details that are not glamorous, but can carry a case across decades. The Mckinley case, then, was not solved only in the laboratory. It was solved in storage rooms, report pages, family trees, patrol notes, evidence logs, and the disciplined habit of checking one fact against another. You, sitting under the lamp, can feel how each part has its own texture. The photograph is glossy. The report is thin and flexible. The lab page is crisp. The evidence label is stiff at the corner. The family tree spreads wider than the case file, carrying ordinary names into a very old question. And through all of this, Tonya's own name remains the center. It can be easy for cold case stories to drift toward technique, especially when the science is compelling. But the Mckinley case did not matter because a method worked. The method mattered because Tonya's life mattered, and because the unanswered question around her had stayed open for the people who loved her. Every careful step, from the first report to the final DNA comparison, points back toward that simple human truth. You may notice that the best cold case work often has a kind of humility in it. No one at the beginning knew everything. No one at the end worked alone. A solved case can look neat when compressed into a few lines, but the real path is rarely neat. It moves through uncertainty, through boxes that have to be found, through tests that may fail, through old interviews that have to be read with fresh eyes. The Mckinley file had to be kept before it could be understood, so we linger with the keeping. We sit with the detective who did not throw away a note because it seemed minor. We sit with the technician who sealed evidence carefully before modern DNA testing was routine. We sit with the cold case investigator who thought to ask whether this old file might be ready for another look. We sit with the genealogist who followed distant relatives across records until a line narrowed. None of these moments is loud, but together they changed the case. As the 2020 arrest moved the Mckinley case from cold file to prosecution, the story entered another quiet, difficult room where answers had arrived late and the legal system still had to do its work. A courtroom file has a different feel from an investigative one. The papers are cleaner, the language more formal, and the edges of the story are arranged into motions, charges, hearings, and dates. You can imagine the Mckinley case being translated into that form, with the human messiness of decades gathered into a structure the court could understand. The atmosphere is less like an archive and more like polished wood, low voices, and the faint echo of footsteps in a hallway. The charge against Daniel Leonard Wells brought the old case into public view again, but even then, the story remained unfinished in a legal sense. An arrest is not a conviction. A DNA match is powerful, but the court process has its own requirements, its own timing, and its own careful protections. As we sit with the file tonight, we hold that distinction gently. The investigation reached a name, and law enforcement moved forward, but the road from arrest to trial is its own kind of waiting. For Tonia's family, that waiting must have felt strange after so many years of having no named person at all. It is one thing to wait in uncertainty, and another to wait after the authorities say they have found the man they believe responsible. The mind may move back and forth between relief and ache, between gratitude for the work and sorrow for the years already gone. You can imagine someone looking at an old photograph of Tonia, touching the edge lightly, and thinking about all the time the picture had survived. The legal file would have needed to account for the long passage of time. That means old witnesses, old procedures, and evidence collected under the standards of another era. It means explaining how a case from 1985 could be tested in 2020, and how the results could be trusted. You can hear attorneys using precise language, not because precision is cold, but because precision is how the system tries to handle grief without letting it become guesswork. Even sorrow must be met with care. Wells did not go to trial. He died in custody after his arrest, and because of that, the Mckinley case did not receive the kind of courtroom ending some families hope for after a long wait. That fact belongs in the file softly, without ornament. It means the investigative answer arrived, but the public trial never did. It means there was no jury verdict to sit beside the DNA evidence, no cross-examination in open court, and no final legal judgment reached in the way the system usually marks its conclusions. This is one of the complicated truths of old solved cases. Sometimes science can identify a person after decades, but time has already changed what justice can look like. A suspect may be elderly, ill, deceased, or as here, never brought through a full trial. The answer can arrive in a form that is both meaningful and incomplete. You, as the quiet detective tonight, can hold both parts at once. The Mckinley case was not left nameless, but it also did not end with every question settled in court. For a family, an answer without a trial may still matter deeply. A name can change the way memory rests. It can end certain kinds of wondering, and it can validate years of belief that the case deserved attention. Yet it may also leave some questions beyond reach. What was said? What was known? Whether anyone else ever suspected? Why the truth took so long to find? These questions do not always have somewhere to go after a suspect dies. They remain in the margins. The investigators, too, may have felt that mixture. To solve a cold case is not always to feel triumph. It can feel like arriving late to a door that should have opened years before. It can bring satisfaction in the work and sadness for the delay. You can imagine a detective closing a folder for the evening, not with excitement, but with a long breath, aware of the people behind the paperwork. The file has moved, at last, but the past is still the past. That is why the language around the Mckinley case needs to stay gentle. It was solved in an investigative sense through DNA and genetic genealogy, and the man authorities accused was identified after decades. But the legal path ended before a trial could test the case fully in open court. This does not erase the work. It gives it its proper shape. The answer came late, and like many late answers, it carried both clarity and quiet incompleteness. When you sit with that shape, the story becomes less about a single ending, and more about the long responsibility of keeping faith with an old file. The people who worked the case could not change what happened in 1985. They could not return the lost years to Tonya's family. What they could do was keep asking whether the evidence still had something to say, and when it did, they could listen carefully enough to understand it. Across the years, that careful listening became the bridge between the first detectives and the later ones, between Pensacola's old streets and the new science that finally narrowed the file. Think again of Pensacola in the first days of January, because cold cases often ask us to return to the beginning after we learn the end. The roads are quieter in memory. The air feels damp and cool on the windshield. Porch lights glow against the dark. Somewhere, a young woman's ordinary routines have been interrupted, and the city does not yet know that a file is beginning that will still be read decades later. You are not there to dramatize it. You are there to notice how ordinary life becomes evidence. A receipt can matter. A witness's sense of time can matter. The direction of travel can matter. So can a phone call, a remembered car, or the way someone describes a face seen only briefly. In 1985, those details would have been gathered with pens and forms, then checked by hand, one after another. You can hear the scratch of ink on paper. You can smell tobacco on a jacket in a small interview room. You can feel the cool metal of a filing cabinet handle. The first investigators likely moved through circles of people who knew Tonya, or knew the places she had been, or might have crossed paths with her near the relevant time. This is ordinary police work, but there is something deeply patient about it. You ask people to remember. You ask them again. You compare one account with another, and you wait for a detail to hold steady. Some details do. Some change. Some never become useful, though the person offering them may have wanted very much to help. In the Mckinley case, as in many cases of that period, investigators had to rely heavily on human memory. Memory is a delicate tool. It can preserve a color, a sound, or a phrase with startling clarity, while losing the exact hour or sequence. A good detective knows this and listens with compassion as well as caution. You, reading the interview notes now, might notice that even uncertain memories carry something human in them, a desire to reach back and place one small thing in the right place. There must have been moments when the investigation seemed to lean toward one possibility, then away from it. This is common in old cases, and it is not failure. It is the process of testing. A lead is followed, then checked. A name is considered, then removed. A rumor is written down, then found too thin to carry. The case narrows and widens again. You can imagine the pages accumulating, each one adding weight to the folder without yet adding finality. Over time, some leads lose their warmth. A person moves. A recollection fades. A record proves incomplete. The detective's notebook fills, and still the central question remains. In a television version, this might be treated as frustration or drama, but in a real investigation, it often becomes something quieter. People go back to work. They file what they have. They answer new calls. The Mckinley case does not vanish. It becomes part of the department's unfinished memory. There is a sadness in that, but also a kind of discipline. Not every case can be solved quickly, and not every answer is available in the era that first asks the question. The old investigators did not have the later tools. They could not build a genetic family tree from a DNA profile. They could not compare distant relatives across public databases in the way later teams could. Their job was to preserve the possibility, even if they could not yet see how that possibility would become real. So, when we return to the beginning, we should not treat 1985 as a failed version of 2020. It was its own time, with its own limitations, and its own careful workers. The Mckinley case survived because enough of that first work was done well enough to be usable later. That is a quiet achievement. It does not erase the pain of the long wait, but it explains how the answer remained reachable across the years. You may imagine the old file being opened many times before the final breakthrough, sometimes with hope, sometimes simply because a cold case review required another look. A detective might sit with the same reports, reading names already underlined by someone else. The paper might carry faint indentations from old staples. A photograph might slide halfway from its sleeve. The room might be silent except for ventilation and the soft turn of pages. This is the sound of persistence. Cold case reviews can be humble work. They do not always begin with a revelation. Sometimes they begin with inventory. What evidence exists? Where is it stored? Has it been tested? Could it be tested again? Were there suspects? Were they eliminated properly? Are there fingerprints, biological samples, clothing, photographs, or recordings that modern technology can revisit? You can feel how practical those questions are, and how much hope can live inside practicality when it is applied with care. In Tonya Mckinley's case, the biological evidence was the thread that lasted. It connected the scene in 1985 to the lab work many years later. It connected the first collection to the later profile. It connected the profile to genealogical matches, and the matches to a family line, and the family line to Daniel Leonard Wells. The thread was thin in the beginning, perhaps not fully understood, but it did not break. That is why the file could finally move. And as the file moved, the case became part of a wider change in American cold case work, where old evidence and new genealogy began to give names to questions once thought almost unreachable. By the late 2010s, genetic genealogy had begun to alter the landscape of cold case investigations. You might remember other cases where long-held evidence suddenly found a path through family records and public databases, and where detectives learned to work alongside genealogists in a way that earlier generations could hardly have imagined. The Mckinley case belongs to that era of reopening, when the dust of old files met the glow of modern screens, and patient work gained a new set of tools. The method sounds technical, but if you sit with it long enough, it becomes almost meditative. A DNA profile is uploaded under strict investigative procedures. Matches appear, often distant, sometimes confusing, rarely simple. The genealogist studies shared segments and estimated relationships, then begins to build trees outward and backward. You see grandparents, great-grandparents, cousins, surnames that change, counties that repeat, and old records that make soft bridges between people who may never have met. You can imagine the process as a table covered in thin paper, each sheet carrying part of a family. One branch runs through one state, another moves south, a marriage joins two lines, and a child's birth record confirms what an obituary suggested. The work requires patience with missing dates and humility about mistakes. A wrong branch can waste hours. A correct one may look unremarkable until it connects to another. Nothing about it rewards haste. In the Mckinley case, this patient reconstruction helped investigators move from unidentified DNA toward Wells. That movement is important because it shows how a cold case can be solved without a living eyewitness suddenly remembering everything. and without a dramatic confession. The answer can come from relationships, from biology, from public records, and from the care with which old evidence was preserved. You, as the detective tonight, can feel how many quiet systems had to meet. There is the police system, with its evidence logs and case numbers. There is the laboratory system, with its profiles, comparisons, and quality controls. There is the genealogical system, with birth records, family names, and careful inference. There is the legal system, with warrants, probable cause, and charging decisions. And beneath all of them, there is the family system, the private world of people who loved Tonya and kept living with the absence no system could fully measure. That last system is the one we should keep returning to. It is easy to talk about breakthroughs as though the technology is the main character. But technology does not sit at a holiday table with an empty chair in mind. It does not watch a child grow up with unanswered questions. It does not keep a photograph in a drawer. The people who waited gave the case its moral weight. The investigators gave it their work. The science gave it a path. All of those things mattered. When Wells was identified, the case also demonstrated the value of not giving up on evidence from an older era. Many cold cases still have boxes like this. Some hold samples that were never tested because the technology was not ready. Some hold samples that were tested once, with older methods, but might now produce more useful results. Some hold evidence no one has reviewed in years, not because no one cares, but because departments have limited time, limited money, and many active cases demanding attention. You can almost see the cold case unit as a room of quiet triage. Files sit in rows. Each one represents a person, a family, and a question. Detectives have to decide which cases may benefit from new testing, which evidence still exists, which laboratories can help, and how to spend resources responsibly. It is not glamorous work. It may involve phone calls, grant applications, spreadsheets, and long afternoons checking storage locations. But when it works, as it did in the Mckinley case, the effect can reach across decades. There is a certain gentleness in the phrase cold case unit, though the work itself can be heavy. It suggests people assigned not just to new emergencies, but to old silences. They are custodians of unfinished stories. They learn to read outdated report styles, track retired officers, and understand forensic methods that were standard before they entered the profession. They become translators between eras. You can imagine one of them placing the Mckinley file on a desk and deciding, quietly, that it deserved another pass. The file would not have objected to waiting a little longer. Files are patient by nature. Paper can sit still for years, though people cannot. That is part of the ache of these cases. The evidence may wait, but families age, detectives retire, witnesses pass away, the world changes while the folder remains. By the time the Mckinley case was solved, the answer arrived in a world far removed from the one that had first needed it. Still, late answers have value. They can correct the record. They can give a family a name. They can show a community that old promises were not entirely abandoned. They can teach investigators how to handle the next old file with more hope and better tools. You might think of Tonya's case as one small lamp among many, not bright enough to erase the darkness behind it, but steady enough to show that persistence can matter. And persistence in this case meant respecting both the old-fashioned detective work and the new scientific path, because neither one could have carried the whole story alone. If you set the 1985 file beside the 2020 genetic report, you can see two kinds of patience. The older patience is handwritten, local, and close to the pavement. It belongs to officers knocking on doors, collecting accounts, and preserving evidence in envelopes and bags. The newer patience is digital, genealogical, and spread across databases and records. It belongs to analysts comparing profiles, building trees, and confirming a lead through modern testing. The Mckinley case needed both forms of patience, and tonight we let them rest side by side. The older patience knew the city. It knew the roads, the neighborhoods, the routines, and the places where people might have crossed paths. It knew how to ask whether someone had seen a car, heard a voice, or noticed an absence. It carried pens, cameras, forms, and the practical habits of local investigation. You can smell rain on a patrol jacket, hear tires on wet pavement, and feel the edge of a notebook pressed into a coat pocket. That world began the case. The newer patience knew networks. It knew how genetic matches might point to shared ancestors, how distant cousins could help define a family line, and how public records could narrow a broad field of possibilities. It carried laptops, lab reports, search tools, and the patience to verify what seemed likely before treating it as meaningful. You can hear a quiet keyboard in the evening, the soft chirp of an incoming email, and the low hush of an office after most people have gone home. Between those two worlds lies the evidence itself, the silent bridge. It had no opinion about time. It did not care whether a report was typed or digitized, whether a detective used a landline or a smartphone, whether a laboratory method had a name that did not yet exist. It simply remained, because someone preserved it. In the Mckinley case, that remaining was everything. The file could cross from one era into the next, because its most important material did not disappear. That may be the most restful part of the story, if rest can be found in such a sober subject. Not everything depends on intensity. Not everything depends on speed. Sometimes, the most important act is careful preservation, the plain habit of placing a thing where it belongs and leaving a clear record behind. You, sitting with the file now, can feel how much trust lives in that habit. It is not dramatic, it is dependable. The people who later reopened the Mckinley case were able to trust certain things because those earlier steps had been done. They could trust that evidence existed. They could ask laboratories to work with it. They could compare the results with confidence. That chain of trust is fragile, and it has to be built one ordinary link at a time. A signature, a date, a sealed package, a storage entry. Each one feels small until a case depends on it. In the sleep, quiet view of detective work, those details become almost rhythmic. Open the file, read the report, check the evidence list, call the lab, wait for results, read again, compare, ask a better question, wait again. The rhythm is not exciting, but it is faithful. It is the rhythm that finally moved Tonya Mckinley's case toward Daniel Leonard Wells after so many years of stillness. There were likely long stretches when no one outside law enforcement and Tonya's family thought about the case at all. That is true of many cold cases. Public attention comes and goes, but the people closest to the loss do not experience it as a passing story. For them, the absence becomes woven into ordinary life. A child grows older, family members age. The world keeps asking them to move through the day, even while one question remains fixed in place. You can imagine how different the case must have looked across generations. In the 1980s, it was current and immediate. In the 1990s, it was an older, unsolved case. Still painful, but already separated from the present by a decade. In the 2000s, it belonged to another era of policing and local memory. By the 2010s, it was old enough that a younger investigator might have been born after the first report was written. Yet, the file still asked the same question. That is the strange continuity of cold cases. Time changes everything around the question, but the question itself stays remarkably steady. Who was responsible? Can the evidence show it? Can the family be told something true? These are simple questions, but they can take lifetimes to answer. In the Mckinley case, the answer came through a technology that no one at the beginning could have relied upon. and through evidence that had waited longer than many careers. When you sit beside that fact, it softens the idea of progress. Progress is not only new machines or new databases. It is also the willingness to apply them to old promises. A laboratory method has little meaning to a cold case unless someone thinks to use it there. A genealogy technique has little meaning unless a department decides an old file is worth the time. The Mckinley case was solved because progress met memory, and memory had not been allowed to fade completely. That meeting did not make the story simple, it made it answerable. There is a difference. A simple story has clean edges and a final line. An answerable story can still carry grief, delay, and unresolved human questions. Tonya's case received a name, a charge, and a scientific link, but it also carried the absence of a trial after Wells died in custody. The file changed, but it did not become weightless. Perhaps that is why this kind of story belongs in a calm voice. It asks for attention without spectacle. It asks us to honor the work without pretending that work can undo the loss. It asks us to notice the people who kept the file, tested the evidence, built the genealogy, and made the arrest, while still keeping Tonya at the center of the page. We can do that quietly. We can do it slowly. The case has waited long enough to be treated with care. And as we keep reading, the next thing to notice is how a single preserved trace became connected to a whole map of family history, and how that map led investigators back toward one man in Pensacola. Family trees can look simple from a distance, but when you lean closer, they become dense with ordinary life. A surname repeats, then changes. A couple moves from one county to another. A child appears in one record, then another, then later in an obituary as a parent or grandparent. The genealogist follows these movements with the patience of someone reading a long letter in faint handwriting. In the Mckinley case, those family lines became a way of moving from unknown DNA toward a possible identity. You can see the work almost like old detective canvassing, but across generations rather than blocks. Instead of knocking on neighboring doors, the genealogist knocks softly on the doors of public records. Birth certificates, marriage indexes, newspaper notices, and family trees begin to answer. Some answers are partial, some are wrong. Some only suggest where to look next, but each useful answer narrows the field, and the narrowing is where the investigation begins to feel its way forward. The DNA match may not point to the person directly. Often, it points to relatives, sometimes distant ones, who share a common ancestor. From there, the investigator has to build downward, finding descendants who could fit the unknown profile by age, sex, location, and circumstance. This is careful reasoning, not guessing. You hold one branch, then another, and you ask whether the pattern makes sense. You do not force it, you let the records teach you. In Tonya Mckinley's case, that teaching eventually led to Wells. He was not found because someone remembered him after decades and walked into the station with a complete answer. He was found because biology and records formed a path that investigators could follow. That path, like many good paths in old cases, was narrow, quiet, and built from many modest stones. You can almost feel them underfoot as you move slowly from one fact to the next. Once a name appears, the work changes again. A genealogical lead is promising, but a detective must step back into the world of evidence and law. Where was this person in the relevant period? What records place him nearby? Can a direct DNA sample be obtained lawfully? Does the comparison support or reject the lead? What else in the file becomes clearer in light of the name? The Mckinley case moved through that doorway. From genealogy to confirmation, the discarded cigarette is a small detail, and small details often carry a strange power in cold cases. You can imagine it not as a dramatic object, but as something ordinary, something the world would otherwise ignore. In the hands of investigators, though, It became a way to compare Wells directly to the old evidence. There is a quiet symbolism in that. Something casually discarded in the present was used to speak to something carefully preserved from the past. The lab comparison linked the two, and with that, the old file shifted. Pages that had sat for years as unanswered history now had a name to hold. Investigators could look back across the reports with new focus. Details that once floated in uncertainty could be read beside the DNA result. The case did not become painless, and it did not become simple, but it became less nameless. For a cold case, that change is profound. You can think of the moment as a lamp being moved closer to the page. The room is still dim, the corners remain shadowed, but the central line becomes readable. This is often all an old investigation can offer after so much time, and sometimes it is enough to change how the story is carried. Tonya Mckinley's case had lived for decades without a named accused person. Then, through preserved evidence and genetic genealogy, the name Daniel Leonard Wells entered the record. The public announcement of an old case arrest has its own quiet ritual. Police officials stand before cameras. They speak of persistence, evidence, and family. Reporters ask questions. Names and dates are repeated for people who may be hearing the case for the first time. But behind that public moment is a much longer private one, made of years when no camera was present and no headline was promised. That private span is where most of the work lived. It lived in storage rooms and laboratories. It lived in old reports and family trees. It lived in the discipline of officers who knew that a case from 1985 still deserved modern attention. And it lived, most of all, in the fact that Tonya's life remained worthy of that attention, no matter how many years had passed. You can feel that worth as a steady presence in the file, quieter than any announcement, but stronger than time. When we follow the Mckinley case this way, we begin to see that solving an old case is not the same as closing it neatly. It is more like placing a long missing piece back into a worn photograph. The picture becomes clearer, but the crease in the paper remains. The people in the picture have still aged. The years are still gone. Yet the act of placing the piece matters, because clarity matters, and because the truth deserves a place to rest. That place was made through patience. It was made by earlier investigators who preserved the evidence, later investigators who reopened the question, scientists who tested what remained, genealogists who followed the family lines, and prosecutors who prepared to bring the charge. Each person held the file briefly, then passed it along. You can imagine the movement from hand to hand, decade to decade, until the old silence finally gave way to a name. And even then, the file still had to be read with tenderness, because a solved cold case is not only a record of what investigators found, but also a record of how long people had to wait. That waiting has its own texture in a file. You see it in the gaps between report dates, in the way a lead from one year is followed by a quiet stretch, then by another review many seasons later. The Mckinley case did not move in a clean line. It moved like many old cases move, with pauses, returns, careful rereadings, and small decisions that only made sense when seen from far away. As you sit with it, you can feel the weight of time in the paper itself. A family waits differently than a file does. Paper can rest in a box without aging in the same way. But people carry the question into kitchens, cars, bedrooms, and ordinary errands. They may hear Tonya's name from a relative, or see a photograph, or notice a date approaching on the calendar. They may stop speaking about it for a while, not because it no longer matters, but because grief sometimes needs silence to continue. You can imagine the question being set down, then picked up again, year after year. Detectives wait differently too. They may move to other assignments, retire, or pass the case to someone younger, but certain files stay in departmental memory. A name comes up in a cold case meeting. An evidence box is checked. A laboratory option is discussed. Someone asks whether a new test could help. The room may smell faintly of toner and coffee, with paper folders open beside computer screens, and the discussion may be quiet enough that it sounds almost ordinary. Yet this is how old promises are kept. In the Mckinley case, the waiting became part of the method. The evidence did not solve the case in 1985, but it did not lose its meaning. Its meaning deepened as the tools changed around it. At first it was a piece of a crime scene investigation. Later it became a possible DNA profile. Later still, it became the beginning of a genetic genealogy search. Each era read the same preserved trace with a little more clarity than the one before. You can think of the file as a room with several lamps. The first lamp was local investigation, casting light on witnesses, places, and immediate facts. The second was forensic testing, stronger than the first, but still limited by the databases available at the time. The third was genealogy, which reached beyond the case itself into family history. None of those lamps lit the whole room alone. Together, slowly, they made one corner readable. That corner held the name Daniel Leonard Wells. Once the name appeared, investigators had to decide how much of the old case it helped explain. They would have reviewed the original evidence again, not as a set of loose facts, but as a record now linked to a specific person. You can imagine the careful concentration in that review, the hush of a conference room, the faint squeak of a marker on a whiteboard, and the quiet awareness that a decades-old question was no longer entirely unanswered. Still, cold cases ask for restraint even when the answer seems close. Especially then, a detective has to keep the door open to doubt until the evidence closes it properly. A prosecutor has to think ahead to the courtroom. A laboratory has to keep its work precise. The Mckinley case moved toward an arrest because enough pieces aligned, but each piece still had to be handled in order. That order is not a delay for its own sake. It is the structure that lets an answer be trusted. Trust is a delicate word in old investigations. Families have to trust that the case was not forgotten. Detectives have to trust the evidence record. Scientists have to trust the integrity of the sample. Courts have to trust the chain that connects the old item to the new result. The public may only see the final announcement, but behind it is this layered trust, built slowly and tested carefully. In Tonya Mckinley's case, that trust had to span more than 3 decades. You can feel those decades if you pause over the dates. 1985 sits near the beginning of the file, typed or written in the older style. 2020 appears later, clean and modern, with its own hard brightness. Between them are years when children became adults, when detectives changed desks, when laboratories learned new techniques, and when Pensacola itself kept living around an unsolved case. The 2 dates face each other across the file like distant shorelines. When the arrest happened, it did not erase that distance. It simply built a bridge across it. You can imagine that bridge not as something grand, but as a narrow walkway made of labels, signatures, lab reports, interviews, and public records. Each board had to hold. Each step depended on the one before it. The Mckinley case crossed because enough of that patient construction remained strong. The bridge also connects 2 kinds of memory. There is official memory, the memory of case numbers, evidence logs, and reports. Then there is family memory, the memory of Tonya's voice, her habits, her child, the shape of her presence in a room. Official memory can identify a suspect. Family memory keeps the person from becoming only a case. As you read, you keep both forms near you, because the file needs both to be understood properly. The old investigators may have written with restraint, as police reports often do. Reports are not made for poetry. They are made for accuracy, for sequence, for facts that can be checked later. Yet beneath that plain language, there is human labor. Someone went to the scene. Someone spoke with people who were upset or frightened. Someone collected evidence without knowing whether it would ever answer the central question. The report may be dry, but the work behind it was not empty. Later investigators had their own plain language. They wrote about profiles, matches, confirmatory samples, and probable cause. They used terms that belong to laboratories and legal systems. But beneath that language, too, there is human labor. Someone traced a family line late into the evening. Someone compared details, corrected an error, and tried again. Someone waited for the lab to return a result. Someone had to make the call when the result arrived. The Mckinley case teaches, quietly, that cold case work is often a collaboration between people who never meet. The first officer and the later genealogist may be separated by decades. The technician who preserved an item may never know the analyst who eventually tested it. A detective who retired with the case unsolved may not be present when another detective stands before cameras years later, yet their efforts touch one another inside the file, and that touching is one form of continuity. You can imagine those efforts like pages layered together. The first page is the immediate report. The next page is an interview. Another is an evidence list. Years later, a lab request is added, then a genealogical lead, then a confirmatory comparison, then an arrest affidavit. The stack grows thicker, and the paper edges no longer line up perfectly, but the story inside it has gained shape. The Mckinley file has become a record of persistence as much as a record of loss. That persistence was not constant in the way a candle burns constantly. It was more like a lamp turned on whenever someone returned to the room. There were dark intervals, no doubt, when no new lead moved, and no test could yet help. But the lamp came on again. A review began. A question was asked. A sample was considered. A new method was applied. Over time, those returns mattered more than uninterrupted attention could have, because they kept the case available to the future. The future, when it arrived, looked like forensic genetic genealogy. It looked like distant relatives appearing as data points, and then becoming names in public records, and then becoming branches in a tree. It looked like investigators narrowing possibilities until one man's name required direct testing. It looked like a cigarette collected not as litter, but as a way to ask science a direct question. You can hear how modern the process is, and also how old-fashioned its patience remains. Because even with modern tools, the human mind still has to compare, question, and verify. A computer can display matches, but it cannot feel the responsibility of accusing the right person. A database can estimate relationships, but it cannot decide which branch deserves the next hour of work. A lab can produce a result, but investigators must place that result in the full case. The Mckinley investigation depended on technology, but it was not replaced by technology. People still had to listen. Listening is an underestimated part of detective work. It means listening to witnesses, but also listening to records, to inconsistencies, to what evidence can and cannot say. It means hearing a family's need without letting emotion distort the proof. It means hearing the old file on its own terms, rather than forcing it into a modern shape too quickly. As you sit beside the Mckinley case tonight, you can almost feel that listening in the silence between paragraphs. There is a softness to the archive when no one is speaking. Boxes sit level on shelves, labels face outward, fluorescent light rests on grey floors, a rolling ladder may stand near the far wall, and the air may feel slightly cooler than the hallway. In that kind of room, old cases do not announce themselves. They wait for a hand to reach for them. Tonya's case waited there, or in rooms like it, while the world outside became able to read what had been preserved. Perhaps some investigator, years before the breakthrough, looked at the Mckinley file and felt the limits of the moment. The evidence was there, but the method was not. The suspect list did not hold the answer. A database search did not return the needed match. The file could be reviewed, but not resolved. There is humility in reaching that point and still preserving the work well enough for someone else. It means accepting that the answer may belong to a later hand. That later hand came with new tools, but it still owed something to the old patience. When the profile was used in genetic genealogy, it carried the first investigation forward. When the family tree narrowed toward Wells, it carried the lab work forward. When the discarded cigarette was compared, it carried the genealogy into a direct test. Each phase depended on the previous one. You can feel the sequence settling into place, not as a sudden turn, but as a long-held breath released gradually. The name Daniel Leonard Wells entered the case because that sequence held. He had lived long enough to be found by the investigation, and the investigation had lasted long enough to find him. That sentence carries a strange stillness. It reminds us that time can be both obstacle and instrument. The years made the case harder, but they also brought the science that pointed to him. In old casework, time is never only one thing. For Tonya's family, the identification of Wells may have changed the shape of memory. Before, the unknown person responsible might have been imagined in many ways, or not imagined at all, because imagining was too painful. After the arrest, there was a name, a face, an age, a legal record. That does not heal everything. It can make some thoughts heavier, but it can also end the particular loneliness of not knowing whom the evidence had been pointing toward for so long. You can imagine how carefully investigators would need to speak with family members. The words would have to be plain, because false softness can feel like distance. They would also have to be kind, because the news was not only information, it was the reopening of a story that had lived for decades inside real people. A phone call, a meeting, a folder on a table, perhaps a photograph nearby. The room would hold relief and sorrow together. That togetherness is one of the hardest parts of cold case resolution. The same development can comfort and hurt. The same name can answer a question and raise others. The same arrest can feel both late and necessary. If you hold the Mckinley case gently, you do not try to make those feelings simpler than they are. You let them remain layered, the way old paper remains layered in a file. Some pages explain, some only witness. The public often wants solved to mean finished. But in the quiet study of a case like this, solved means something more specific. It means investigators identified the person they believed responsible and supported that identification with evidence. It does not mean the family's grief ended. It does not mean every detail became known. It does not mean the years were restored. The Mckinley case was solved through patient work, but its human story remained more tender than that word can hold. This is why we keep returning to Tonya's name. Her name steadies the narrative. Without it, we might drift too far into methods, timelines, and legal outcomes. With it, we remember why the methods mattered. Tonya Etheridge Mckinley was not an old problem for science to solve. She was a young woman whose life mattered before any report was written. The case file exists because something precious was lost, and the investigation matters because that loss deserved truth. You can see how the file changes when her name appears in different contexts. In the first reports, it identifies the person at the center of the immediate investigation. In cold case reviews, it identifies an unresolved duty. In the genetic genealogy phase, it connects an old evidence sample to a renewed search. In the arrest records, it becomes part of the formal accusation against Wells. The same name moves through different systems, but it remains hers, and that matters. Names are important in old cases. They prevent abstraction. The Mckinley case is not only a case number, not only a DNA profile, not only an example of genetic genealogy. It is Tonya's case. It is also a record of investigators who tried, first with the tools they had, then with tools their predecessors could not have imagined. When we say the name quietly, we are not making the story dramatic. We are giving it back its human center. In the practical work of the case, names also function as keys. A family name can open a branch of genealogy. A married name can connect records that first seem unrelated. A middle initial can separate one person from another. A detective checking public records may spend hours resolving these small differences. You can imagine the patience required to avoid mistaking one person for another, especially when decades have passed and records are incomplete. The genealogical search in the Mckinley case likely involved many such careful distinctions. A match may have suggested one line, then another. A family tree may have led towards several possible men before age and location narrowed the list. Wells emerged not from a single record, but from convergence. Convergence is a quiet word, and a useful one. It means different lines of evidence began to meet in the same place, gently but firmly. Once convergence appears, the investigator's task is to test it. That is where the discarded cigarette mattered. It moved the inquiry from shared family probability to individual comparison. You can picture the sample going to the lab, the paperwork accompanying it, the waiting while analysis was performed. Waiting for lab results is its own small season in an investigation. The case has moved, but everyone must pause until the science answers. When the answer came back, it connected Wells to the preserved evidence. That connection gave investigators enough to move forward with an arrest. There is a quiet gravity in that moment, not a flourish, not a spectacle, just a report read carefully, perhaps reread, then discussed with prosecutors. A detective may have sat back for a moment, looking at the page, aware that the file had carried this possibility for decades without anyone being able to name it. The arrest itself belongs to procedure. Officers locate the person. Papers are served. The accused is taken into custody. Reports are written. The public record changes. In a case like this, every step has the strange feeling of the present touching the past. The person arrested in 2020 is being accused in relation to an event from 1985 when the world looked and sounded different. The law reaches backward, but it does so through documents made today. You can imagine Wells as an older man by then, far removed in age from the time of Tonya's case. That is another feature of old investigations. People do not stay fixed at the age they were when evidence was left behind. They age, work, move, form relationships, and live under ordinary names. A cold case arrest can reveal that someone's later life existed beside an unanswered past. The contrast is unsettling, but we do not need to sharpen it tonight. We only note it and keep the file steady. After the arrest, the case would have required arraignment, legal representation, motions, and eventual preparation for trial had events continued that way. The courtroom process is slow even in newer cases, and older cases can be slower still. Evidence must be disclosed, experts must be prepared, defense attorneys must review testing and procedure, prosecutors must make sure the old file can be explained clearly. Justice, when it works carefully, is not quick by nature. But Wells died before trial, and that fact changed the path. The case could not proceed to a verdict. The charge could not be tested before a jury. The courtroom, which might have become the final public forum for the evidence, did not have that chance. You can feel the file hesitate there. It had finally moved after decades, and then one form of resolution became unavailable. That is not a dramatic twist. It is a sober fact of an old case, meeting human mortality. For the family, this may have meant receiving an answer without the formal finality of conviction. For investigators, it may have meant knowing the evidence had identified their suspect, while also knowing the court would never complete its process. For the public, it may have made the word solved feel both true and incomplete. You, sitting with the file, can let that complexity remain. It does not need to be forced into a cleaner shape. Cold case work often asks us to accept imperfect outcomes. Sometimes the suspect is gone before identification. Sometimes evidence points strongly to someone who can never be tried. Sometimes a family receives a name but not a full account. Sometimes a case is closed by science but not by confession. testimony, or verdict. The Mckinley case sits among those stories, where the answer arrived, yet not every human need could be met. Still, the answer mattered. It matters that Tonya's case did not remain unidentified forever. It matters that preserved evidence was honored. It matters that old work was not treated as useless simply because it was old. It matters that investigators used new tools to revisit a young woman's case from 1985. The answer did not undo the waiting, but it changed what the waiting had been leading toward. When you look again at the timeline, the long span becomes less empty. 1985 was the year of the first investigation. The following decades were not a blank, but a period of preservation and occasional return. The later years brought improved DNA testing. The late 2010s brought genetic genealogy into more common investigative use. 2020 brought the arrest of Daniel Leonard Wells. The timeline is slow, but it is not motionless. Motion in cold cases can be hard to see while it is happening. A laboratory develops a new technique far from the case. A genealogy company builds a tool for family history. A public database grows. A cold case investigator attends a training. A grant becomes available. A department inventories evidence. None of these things appears at first to solve Tonya Mckinley's case. Together, eventually, they help make the solution possible. That is why patient detective work can feel almost like tending a garden in winter. Much of what matters happens below the surface. The soil looks still, the branches look bare, yet something is being preserved, and something may later grow when the season changes. In the Mckinley case, the season changed when forensic genealogy gave investigators a way to move from unknown DNA toward a person. The seed had been the evidence, kept safe across all those years. You can return, for a moment, to the evidence room. The shelf is still, the box is ordinary. The label may not look important to anyone who does not know the story, but inside are items that connected a young woman's case to the future. The room may smell of cardboard, dust, and old tape. A vent may stir the air softly. Somewhere nearby, another unsolved file waits for the same kind of attention, and the same question is quietly present. Is there something here that new science can now understand? In that sense, the Mckinley case became a lesson for other cases. It showed that decades-old evidence can still matter. It showed that genetic genealogy can help when traditional databases do not. It showed that confirmatory testing is essential. It showed that old cases deserve fresh eyes, not because every one will be solved, but because some will. You can imagine a detective thinking of Tonya's case when opening another box, treating the contents with renewed care. The lesson is not only technological, it is emotional too. It tells families that the passing of years does not always close every door. It tells investigators that preservation can outlast discouragement. It tells communities that a case may leave the headlines and still remain alive in quieter rooms. It tells us, tonight, that patience is not passive when it is joined to careful action. The Mckinley case was not solved by waiting alone. It was solved by waiting, preserving, returning, and asking again. Asking again as one of the gentlest and strongest acts in detective work. The first question may fail because the tool is not ready. Years later, the same question, asked differently, may produce an answer. Who left this evidence? Who shares this genetic pattern? Which family line fits? Which person can be confirmed? In the Mckinley case, the question was asked across time until it finally found the method that could answer it. You can feel that rhythm as you read. Ask, record, wait. Ask again, test, wait. Ask again, compare, narrow. Ask again, confirm. The rhythm is slow enough for sleep, but it is also the rhythm of serious work. It respects uncertainty. It does not demand that the file give more than it can. It lets each answer lead to the next question. And when the next question is not yet possible, It keeps the file safe until it is. There is comfort, perhaps, in that kind of care. Not comfort in the loss itself, but comfort in the fact that people can respond to loss with steadiness. Letting a breath, they can label, preserve, remember, and return. They can use new knowledge without dismissing old labor. They can tell a family, after many years, that the evidence has finally named someone. They can acknowledge what is still missing without pretending the work meant nothing. The Mckinley case asks for exactly that balance. It asks us to see the breakthrough without making it a spectacle. It asks us to honor the science without letting the science overshadow Tonya. It asks us to understand the arrest without forgetting the absence of a trial. It asks us to notice the long patience of investigators while remembering that the longest patience belonged to the people who loved her. You can sit with all of that under the lamp and let the file remain open a little longer. If you run your mind back over the preserved evidence, it may help to imagine the hands that handled it across time. First, gloved hands at the scene, careful and practical. Later, hands in an evidence room, checking labels. Later still, laboratory hands preparing a test. Then, a genealogist's hands moving between keyboard and notes. Finally, investigators' hands holding the report that linked Wells to the case. The same thread passed through many hands, and none of them had the whole story alone. This is often how truth is carried in institutions. One person does a part, another person does another. Records make the handoff possible. Procedures protect the meaning of small things. Patience turns separate acts into continuity. In the Mckinley case, the continuity lasted long enough for an old file to become newly answerable. Without that continuity, even the best modern tools might have had nothing reliable to read. The quietest part of the story may be the evidence log. It is not poetic. It is not emotional. It is a list, a record, a chain. Yet it may be one of the most important documents in the file. It says where something was, who had it, when it moved, and how it was stored. A good evidence log is a promise written in plain language. It promises that the item tested now is connected to the item collected then. In an old case, that promise is everything. You can imagine the log as a kind of spine running through the Mckinley file. Around it are witness statements, lab reports, genealogical notes, and legal documents. The spine holds the case upright. It is easy to overlook because it lacks narrative, but without it, the narrative might not stand. This is another reason patient administrative work deserves respect. It may feel far from the emotional center of a case, yet it protects the path by which the truth can be known. When the DNA comparison confirmed the genealogical lead, that path became visible. Wells could be tied to the preserved evidence. Investigators could move from possibility to probable cause. Prosecutors could prepare charges. The case that had once depended on unanswered interviews now had a scientific foundation. You can hear the difference in the file's tone, even if the paper itself is silent. The question has not vanished, but it has shifted. The shift does not make the earlier witnesses unimportant. Their statements still belong to the case. They still show the setting, the timeline, the efforts made in 1985. They still reflect a community trying to help. The DNA answer rests among those older materials, not above them. A cold case solution is strongest when it respects the whole file, the old human accounts as well as the new scientific result. The Mckinley case deserves that full reading. And so, as you sit with the documents, you may notice how many kinds of evidence can coexist. There is physical evidence, preserved and tested. There is documentary evidence, recorded in reports and logs. There is genealogical evidence, inferred through family relationships. There is contextual evidence, showing where people were and how the timeline could work. Each kind has its own weight. Each must be handled according to its nature. Together, they form the case investigators believed they could bring. Because Wells died before trial, the public never watched those kinds of evidence arranged before a jury. That absence matters. A trial would have given the prosecution a place to present the full chain and the defense a place to question it. Without that process, the case's resolution rests in the investigative and charging record rather than a verdict. We can say that plainly, without letting it disturb the calm. It is simply the shape the real story took. The real story, like many old cases, is not shaped like fiction. It does not offer every conversation, every motive, or every missing detail. It offers a young woman's name, a long investigation, preserved evidence, modern genealogy, a suspect identified, an arrest made, and a legal process that ended before trial. That is enough to understand the patience of the work, though not enough to answer every human question. The remaining spaces are part of the file too. You can let those spaces be quiet. Not every blank must be filled with speculation. In fact, careful detective work often depends on resisting speculation when evidence does not support it. We do not need to imagine what cannot be known. We can stay with what the file gives us. Pensacola, 1985, Tonya Etheridge Mckinley. Preserved evidence. Genetic genealogy. Daniel Leonard Wells, 2020. A case that waited and then moved. There is a kind of peace in staying close to the record. It keeps the story respectful. It keeps us from turning real people into characters shaped for excitement. It lets the work itself be enough. You can feel the old folder beneath your hands, and you do not need to press it for more drama. The drama, if we can even use that word softly, is in the endurance of the question and the care that finally answered part of it. Maybe that is why cold case detectives often speak about persistence in such plain terms. They know the work is not romantic. They know it includes dead ends, budget limits, old storage problems, and long waits for lab results. They know that some families will never receive even the answer Tonya's family received. But they also know that some files change when they are reopened with the right tools. The Mckinley case became one of those files. The change depended on timing. If the evidence had been lost, the method would not matter. If genetic genealogy had not matured, the profile might have remained unidentified. If investigators had not returned to the case, the evidence might have remained silent. If a confirmatory sample had not been obtained, the genealogy might have remained only a lead. Each condition had to meet the next. The solution was a convergence of readiness. Readiness can take decades. That is a strange thought, but a useful one in old mysteries. Sometimes a case is not ready, because the science is not ready. Sometimes the science is ready, but the evidence has not been located. Sometimes the evidence exists, but funding or policy has not caught up. Sometimes the lead appears, but confirmation takes time. In Tonya Mckinley's case, enough forms of readiness finally met, and the file was able to move. You can imagine a cold case detective learning to live with that uncertainty. They do not know which file will respond to a new test. They do not know which sample has survived well enough. They do not know which genealogy search will narrow cleanly. They simply begin where the record allows. They check, request, wait, and read. That steadiness is not dramatic, but it is deeply human. It is a way of refusing to let the unknown have the last word too easily. The unknown had held the Mckinley case for many years. It held the name of the person responsible out of reach. It held back certain explanations. It left the family with absence instead of clarity. But the unknown was not permanent in every respect. The preserved evidence eventually broke part of its hold. That is what cold case work can sometimes do. It does not conquer all uncertainty. It removes one piece of it, carefully, and gives that piece a name. Once a name is given, the past may be reread. People may think back to who Wells was, where he lived, whether he crossed known paths, whether there were overlooked signs. Some of that rereading may be useful. Some may be only the mind trying to make sense of a late answer. We should be gentle with that impulse. When truth arrives after decades, people naturally look backward and ask whether it could have arrived sooner. Sometimes the honest answer is painful. Sometimes it is simply unclear. Investigators can ask that question too. Could this have been solved earlier? Was a clue missed? Did technology make the difference? In many old DNA cases, the most truthful answer is that earlier investigators lacked the tools that later solved the case, though they may also have faced the ordinary imperfections of human work. The Mckinley case, from what is publicly known, appears to have depended heavily on preserved evidence and modern genealogy. That does not make the wait easy, but it helps explain it. Explaining a wait is not the same as justifying it. A family's years cannot be balanced neatly against a timeline of scientific progress. The years were still years. Tonya's child still grew up without answers that should have come sooner if the world had been able to provide them. The people who loved her still carried the silence. We can acknowledge the value of the breakthrough and the cost of the delay in the same breath, because both are true. That kind of balanced acknowledgement is part of patient narration. It resists neatness. It keeps the case from becoming a lesson only about technology, or only about sorrow. The Mckinley case is both a story of loss and a story of method. It is both a record of delay and a record of persistence. It is both solved and incomplete in the ways old cases sometimes are. You can hold these paired truths quietly, like two pages open side by side. If the file were in front of you, perhaps one page would show the earliest date, the first week of January 1985. Another page would show the 2020 arrest. Between them, the years are implied more than shown. You might rest your hand there, on the middle of the stack, because the middle is where most of life happens. Waiting does not feel like a headline while it is happening. It feels like ordinary days passing over an unanswered question. Ordinary days have their own sounds. A refrigerator hums in a kitchen. A car door shuts on a damp morning. Rain taps on a window. A phone rings, and it is not the call someone hoped for. Years of ordinary days can make a cold case feel both distant and always present. The Mckinley case lived in that space for Tonya's family, distant from public attention and present in private memory. When the answer came, it did not restore those ordinary days. It added a new fact to them. Daniel Leonard Wells had been identified through DNA and genealogy. Authorities believed he was responsible. The old evidence had held his connection to the case. These facts may have settled some questions, but they also arrived after so much life had already unfolded. The file moved forward, while the people connected to it had been moving forward all along, carrying what they had to carry. You can hear how different that is from a neat ending. It is more like a change in the light. The same room, the same furniture, the same old photograph, but now one corner is visible that had been shadowed for years. The shadow does not vanish entirely. It shifts. It becomes possible to name what stood there. That is what the Mckinley investigation achieved, and it is no small thing. The work also reminds us that justice is not a single moment. It can be collection, preservation, testing, identification, arrest, trial, verdict, memory, and public acknowledgement. Sometimes all of those things happen. Sometimes only some of them do. In the Mckinley case, collection, preservation, testing, identification, and arrest occurred, but trial and verdict did not. The absence of those final legal steps leaves a space, and the space should be named gently when the time comes. For now, we keep moving through the investigation because the path itself is where the patient work lives. We look at the old collection, the later testing, the genealogical narrowing, the confirmatory cigarette sample, and the arrest. We notice how each step depends on the discipline of the one before it. We let the room stay quiet. The file is not asking us to solve it tonight. It is asking us to understand how it was solved, and why the solving took so long. There is something almost tactile about understanding. You feel the smoothness of a photograph sleeve. You feel the powdery dryness of an old report. You feel the slight resistance of a file drawer that has not been opened in months. You feel the cool edge of a lab report page. These sensations remind you that investigations are not only ideas. They are physical acts done by people in rooms, with objects, under lights, across years. The Mckinley case passed through many such rooms: a police office in the 1980s, an evidence storage area, a laboratory, a cold case workspace, a genealogist's desk, a prosecutor's office, a courtroom file. Each room added something or protected something. Each room had its own quiet sounds and textures. Together, they formed the path from Tonya's unsolved case to the identification of Wells. If we walk that path slowly enough, we notice that nothing in it required spectacle. The decisive moments were practical. Preserve the evidence, test the evidence, search the genealogy, confirm the lead, make the arrest, prepare the case. These are plain verbs, and plain verbs suit the story. They keep us grounded in the work rather than the noise around it. They let the patience show. Patience can sound passive in ordinary conversation, but in cold case work, it is active. It means continuing to care when a case no longer has momentum. It means maintaining records so another person can understand them later. It means learning new methods and applying them responsibly. It means telling a family the truth about uncertainty. It means returning to a hard question without promising more than the evidence can deliver. The Mckinley case was solved by that active kind of patience. You can imagine the detectives who reopened it, having to balance hope with caution. Hope says the new method might work. Caution says the evidence must be reviewed first. Hope says a DNA profile may find a family line. Caution says every genealogical inference must be checked. Hope says the suspect can be named. Caution says confirmation is necessary. This balance is the heartbeat of good cold case work. Steady and measured. In a quiet way, that balance also helps the listener breathe with the story. Nothing rushes, nothing lunges. Each fact arrives when it is ready. Tonya's name returns because she remains the reason for the work. Wells's name appears where the evidence brings it. The years sit between them, not as empty space, but as the long corridor the investigation had to travel. We walk that corridor slowly, with the file open and the lamp low. At times, the corridor may seem almost too long. More than 3 decades is a great distance in any life. It is long enough for neighborhoods to change, for children to become adults, for old technologies to vanish from desks and pockets. In 1985, investigators could not have imagined the everyday digital world that would later help solve the Mckinley case. The future was not visible to them. Their contribution was to preserve what the future would need. That is a humble form of faith. Not faith in a grand sense, necessarily, but faith in procedure, in evidence, in the possibility that careful work may matter later. A person labels an envelope. A person records a date. A person keeps the file. They may never see the answer. They may never receive public credit. But their care becomes part of the solution. You can feel that quiet faith in the Mckinley case, and it gives the story much of its gravity. Gravity is the right word, perhaps, because the case pulls attention downward, toward the desk, the paper, the evidence, the details. It does not ask us to look for spectacle in the distance. It asks us to look closely at what was kept. The oldest objects in the file become the most important. The page edges, the labels, the chain of custody, the sealed evidence, all of it held a future possibility. The ordinary became essential. When modern investigators used genetic genealogy, they were not replacing old work, they were unlocking it. The DNA profile could only point outward because the evidence had survived inward. The family tree could only narrow toward Wells because the biological signal remained. The confirmatory comparison could only matter because the original sample still had meaning. Every modern step leaned on the old foundation. That is the central architecture of the Mckinley case. And architecture is built to bear weight. This file had to bear the weight of grief, the weight of years, the weight of legal scrutiny, and the weight of public attention once the arrest was announced. It had to be strong enough for a family to hear the news and for authorities to name a suspect. That strength did not appear suddenly. It was built slowly by people who did their parts. The people who built it may have had very different relationships to the case. Some may have known Tonya's name from the beginning. Others may have encountered it decades later as part of a cold case review. Some may have handled only a lab sample or a genealogy branch. Yet each person entered the story at the point where their skill was needed. That is another form of patience, letting a case wait until the right kinds of skill can gather around it. When enough skill gathered around the Mckinley case, the old file could finally answer the question it had carried. Not all questions, but the central investigative one. Who did the evidence identify? Daniel Leonard Wells. That answer was the result of preservation and modern comparison, and it changed the official understanding of the case. You can let that line rest quietly on the page, because it represents years of work compressed into a few words. After such compression, it helps to unfold the line again. Wells was not found by chance alone. He was found through a structured process. The DNA evidence produced a profile. Genetic genealogy used that profile to find relatives and build toward possible identities. Investigators focused on Wells. A discarded cigarette provided a direct sample. The sample matched the evidence. Authorities arrested him. Each sentence is simple. Together, they describe a long, careful road. That road did not end in the way many people might have expected after an arrest. Wells's death in custody meant that the courtroom never became the final setting. The case did not receive a trial narrative with opening statements, expert testimony, and a verdict. Instead, its resolution remained grounded in investigative findings and the charges brought before his death. That may feel unfinished, and it is, in a legal sense. But it is still far from the nameless uncertainty that came before. You can think of the difference as the distance between a locked room and a room with the door partly open. Before the breakthrough, investigators had preserved the room but could not enter fully. After the DNA and genealogy work, the door opened enough to show who the evidence pointed toward. The room did not become entirely illuminated. Some corners remained, but the central figure was no longer hidden, and that changed the case permanently. This quiet permanence matters. Official records changed. Public understanding changed. Tonya's family was no longer told only that the case was unsolved. They could be told what the investigation had found. Future discussions of the Mckinley case would include Wells's name and the genetic genealogy work that led to him. The old silence did not disappear from memory, but it was no longer the final word. As you read onward, you may notice that the case also invites reflection on how many other files might be waiting for similar attention. Somewhere in another evidence room, a box may hold a sample collected before its full value was understood. Somewhere, a detective may be considering whether a genealogy lab can help. Somewhere, a family may be waiting with the same mixture of hope and caution. The Mckinley case does not promise every answer, but it shows that some doors still open. That knowledge can be handled gently. Hope in cold cases should not be loud. Loud hope can become pressure, and pressure can hurt families when a test fails or a lead collapses. Gentle hope is different. It says the file is worth reviewing. It says evidence may still matter. It says new tools can be tried carefully. It says no promise should be made before the proof arrives. The Mckinley case is an example of gentle hope becoming useful. Useful hope shows up as action. It requests the test. It builds the tree. It checks the records. It confirms the lead. It speaks to the family. It prepares the legal paperwork. It does not simply feel, it works. In Tonya's case, that work gave investigators a name after many years, and that name became part of the record. You can feel the steadiness of that usefulness in the file, like a hand resting flat on the page. The atmosphere of the case, then, is not one of sudden revelation. It is one of accumulated care. A single DNA match may appear to be the moment everything changed, but the match itself was only possible because of earlier accumulation. Reports, evidence, storage, testing, genealogical research, and legal review had been gathering weight for years. When the breakthrough came, it stood on that gathered weight. Without it, the moment would have had nowhere to stand. There is no need to hurry past this. The gathered weight is the story. It is what separates patient detective work from mere luck. Luck may play a role in any investigation, but it cannot preserve evidence for decades. 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 The Mckinley case required more than luck. It required a long chain of care. You can hear that chain softly, link by link. A report typed, a label written, a box stored, a file reviewed, a sample tested, a match found, a tree built, a name checked, a cigarette collected, a comparison made, an arrest carried out. None of these sounds is loud, but together they make the music of a cold case finally moving. It is a low, careful music, suitable for a room where the lamp is the brightest thing. As the night deepens around the story, the file becomes less like an object and more like a witness to endurance. It has seen the first confusion, the long silence, the technological change, and the late answer. It has held Tonya's name across years when the world outside did not always speak it. It has carried the evidence that eventually pointed to Wells. It has become a record, not only of what happened, but of how people continued to ask what could still be known. That question, what can still be known, is central to every cold case. It is smaller and more honest than asking for everything. Everything may not be available, but something may be. A name may be recoverable. A timeline may be clarified. A mistaken suspicion may be lifted. A family may receive information that changes the way they carry the past. In the Mckinley case, what could still be known turned out to be deeply significant. The file, of course, cannot speak about its own weighting. That is why we speak carefully for it, using the record, not invention, and leaving the unknowns where they belong. We can say that Tonya was found in Pensacola in January of 1985. We can say the case remained unsolved for decades. We can say preserved evidence and genetic genealogy led investigators to Daniel Leonard Wells. We can say he was arrested in 2020 and died before trial. We can say the work mattered. Around those facts, we place atmosphere, not to decorate them, but to help them be heard slowly. The humid air of Pensacola, the smell of old paper, the pale light of offices, the faint static of memory, the cool surface of a lab report, the quiet weight of a cardboard box. These details keep the story human and grounded. They remind you that the investigation happened in real rooms, to real people, across real years. And somewhere within those years, perhaps more than once, a detective must have wondered whether the Mckinley case would ever move again. That wondering belongs to the work. It is not despair. It is the honest knowledge that some cases resist every available method. The detective still reads, still checks, still asks. When a new method appears, the file is ready because someone did not mistake uncertainty for uselessness. Uncertainty is difficult to preserve. People prefer clear endings. Institutions prefer resolved files. Families deserve answers. Yet cold cases often require people to live with uncertainty while still protecting the possibility of certainty later. That is a delicate discipline. It means neither forcing an answer nor abandoning the search. The Mckinley investigation, across its long arc, shows that discipline at work. You can feel the discipline in the absence of overstatement. The evidence said what it said. The genealogy pointed where it pointed. The confirmatory sample either matched or it did not. The detectives followed the result into legal action. Then the legal process stopped when Wells died. The facts are enough. They do not need to be made sharper. Their plainness carries the weight. Plain facts can be deeply moving when they have waited long enough. Tonya Mckinley's name, the year 1985, the city of Pensacola, the preserved DNA, the genetic genealogy, the name Daniel Leonard Wells, the arrest in 2020. Each one is a simple marker. Together, they trace a path from loss to identification, from uncertainty to a partial answer, from an old file to a modern resolution, shaped by both science and time. As you turn the page now, you are still not at an ending. You are deeper inside the patient middle, where the facts have been named, but the meaning continues to settle. The Mckinley case asks us to keep our voice low and our attention steady. It asks us to notice that solving a case after decades is not a burst of energy, but a long exhale. The file has more silence in it than speech, and we follow that silence carefully, one page at a time. One page at a time is how a cold case allows itself to be known. You do not rush to the last report, because the middle pages tell you what kind of patience was required. The Mckinley case is not only the story of a DNA result in 2020, it is the story of everything that had to remain intact before that result could mean anything. You can rest your hand on the stack and feel that steadiness before you keep reading. The early pages still matter after the science arrives. They show the shape of the original investigation, the roads checked, the people spoken to, and the first attempt to understand Tonya Mckinley's last known hours. Those pages carry the atmosphere of 1985, when police work was closer to paper, doorways, and direct memory than to databases. A detective might have walked from one porch to another with a notebook in hand, hearing dogs bark behind fences and traffic passing softly beyond the curb. Each conversation added a small weight to the file. As you look at those old interviews, you can imagine how hard it is to separate memory from worry. People who knew Tonya may have wanted to help so badly that they searched their minds for anything useful: a time, a place, a person seen nearby, a remark that seemed ordinary then but uncertain now. The investigator listening had to hold compassion and caution together, because a witness can be sincere and still mistaken. That balance is one of the quiet skills of the work. The Mckinley case asked investigators to build from fragments. A cold January date. A young woman's routines. A city with its own familiar patterns. Evidence collected and sealed. People interviewed, some more than once. Leads opened, followed, and set aside when they could not hold. You can hear the old file growing thicker, not with certainty yet, but with effort. The effort itself becomes visible when the answer is late. In the first months, the case may have felt as if it should yield, if enough people were asked enough questions. Many investigations begin with that hope. Someone must have seen something, someone must know a name, someone must remember a car, a conversation, or a face. But some cases resist that first wave of attention. The Mckinley case did. It moved from immediate inquiry into longer review, and then into the difficult category of an unresolved file. That transition has a feeling. It is not a door slamming shut. It is more like the sound in an office after most people have gone home, when the fluorescent lights still hum and a folder remains open on a desk. The questions are still there, but the next obvious step has vanished. A detective rereads what has already been written. A name is circled again. A report is checked against another report. The work becomes quieter, but not necessarily less serious. When a case becomes cold, the emotional life around it does not cool in the same way. For Tonya's family, the date did not become an old date simply because years passed. It remained attached to memory. It may have surfaced in January, or on birthdays, or in conversations where her name arrived gently and changed the room. You can imagine, A family member opening a drawer and seeing a photograph. The paper slightly curled, the image holding a younger face that time could not update. A photograph can become an anchor in an old case. It keeps a person present in a way reports cannot. The police file may list names, times, and evidence, but a photograph returns the person's posture, expression, and life outside the investigation. In the Mckinley case, the public record may give us only a limited view of Tonya, yet even that limited view is enough to remind us that the investigation was never about an abstraction. It was about her. That reminder matters when the story turns toward science. DNA can sound impersonal, almost mathematical, and genetic genealogy can sound like a puzzle being solved. But every profile in a case like this is tied to a human loss. Every match points back to a person whose life was interrupted and a family that kept waiting. You can let the technical details stay calm, but you do not let them become cold. The Mckinley file asks for warmth as well as accuracy. The preserved evidence became the bridge because it carried information no witness could provide after so many years. Memory fades, but a properly stored sample can remain legible to the right tool. That is not magic. It is preservation, chemistry, procedure, and luck in the ordinary sense that some materials survive better than others. When investigators looked again at the evidence in Tonya's case, they were asking whether something collected in the old world of 1985 could still speak in the newer language of DNA. That question had to be asked carefully. Evidence from an older case may be limited. It may be degraded. It may have been handled before modern standards were routine. Laboratories have to assess what can be tested, what result is reliable, and what limitations should be understood. You can imagine technicians working under bright, clean light, moving slowly, documenting each step, aware that a family's hopes may be resting somewhere beyond the sealed packaging. There is a sensory quiet in a lab that is different from the quiet of an archive. The archive smells of paper and cardboard. The lab smells faintly sterile, with plastic, disinfectant, and cool air. The sounds are small, a drawer sliding shut, a centrifuge, a printer, gloved fingers against a tube. In the Mckinley case, that modern quiet met the older quiet of the file, and between them something changed. A DNA profile is both intimate and abstract. It belongs to a person, yet it appears as data, as markers, as a pattern that can be compared. In a cold case, that pattern may be the first new language the file has learned in years. Investigators can ask whether the profile matches anyone in existing law enforcement systems. If it does not, the answer is not the end of the road. It may simply mean that another kind of search is needed. For Tonya Mckinley's case, that other search became genetic genealogy. You can imagine the shift from one kind of database to another as a change in landscape. Instead of looking only for direct offender matches, investigators began looking for relatives who shared pieces of genetic inheritance. Those relatives were not suspects because they appeared in a search. They were points of orientation, distant lights on the shore, helping investigators understand where the unknown person might belong. That distinction is important. The work must be done with restraint. A relative's presence in a genealogy search is not a mark against them. It is simply a clue to ancestry, a thread in a much larger fabric. The genealogist follows the thread back to shared ancestors, then forward through descendants, always checking whether the path fits the known facts. The work is slow because it has to be fair. In the Mckinley case, fairness and patience were not separate virtues. They were part of the same method. You can picture a genealogy chart beginning as a few names, then widening into rows and branches. Some names are clear, others require confirmation. A marriage record may link one surname to another. An obituary may list children and grandchildren. A census may show a household at one moment in time. The genealogist reads all of it with the calm attention of someone sorting old letters by date. Each record has its own texture, its own small voice. The records themselves are ordinary. They are not written for future detectives. They are written because people were born, married, moved, worked, and died. Yet decades later, those ordinary records can become part of an extraordinary identification. That is one of the humbling parts of genetic genealogy. It uses the everyday paper trail of human life to answer a question born from loss. The Mckinley case was drawn through that everyday trail until Wells came into view. Once a possible identity emerged, the investigation returned from the broad landscape of family history to the narrower path of direct proof. This return is essential. Genealogy can suggest, but the justice system needs confirmation. Investigators obtained DNA from an item connected to Wells, a discarded cigarette, and used it for comparison with the preserved evidence. A cigarette is a small thing, light in the hand, easily crushed or swept away. But in this case it became a modern key to an old door. The comparison linked Wells to the evidence in Tonya's case. You can pause there, because the sentence is plain, and its plainness contains decades. A sample collected when the case was new, evidence kept across years, a profile developed when science allowed, a genealogy search that narrowed the field, a present-day sample used for confirmation. All of that lives inside the word linked. It is a modest word, and it carries a lot. For investigators, that link would have changed the kind of conversations they were having. Before, they may have spoken in terms of possibilities, open leads, and old uncertainties. Afterward, they could speak in terms of probable cause, arrest, and prosecution. The Mckinley case was moving from review into action. Even then, the action remained procedural. Reports had to be written, supervisors had to be briefed, prosecutors had to assess the strength of the evidence. The work did not stop becoming careful just because it became more decisive. Careful action can feel quiet from the outside. There may be no visible sign that a case is nearing a breakthrough until an arrest is announced. Inside the investigation, though, there are meetings, calls, drafts, checks, and more checks. A date is confirmed, a lab result is reviewed, a legal standard is considered. Someone asks whether the chain of custody can be explained from beginning to end. Someone else checks the spelling of a name that has now become central. Names and spellings seem small until they matter. In an old case, a wrong spelling can lead to a wrong record, and a wrong record can waste precious time. Genealogy requires particular care with names because families carry variations, nicknames, initials, and changes across generations. Police work requires similar care because a name in an affidavit must refer to the right person. In the Mckinley case, the name Daniel Leonard Wells had to be placed into the record with the seriousness that an accusation demands. There is gravity in accusation. Even when evidence is strong, the act of naming someone publicly as responsible for a long unsolved case must be grounded. Investigators know this. Prosecutors know it. Families know too, because they have often lived through years of rumors or uncertain suspicions. The Mckinley case moved to an arrest because the evidence gave authorities that ground. Still, the ground had to be stated clearly, not assumed. You can imagine the arrest paperwork as another layer in the file, newer paper on top of older paper. The language is formal. The date belongs to 2020. The accusation reaches back to 1985. There is something almost solemn about that reach. The law is saying that time has passed, but the question did not expire. The evidence remained, the name was found, and the case could now be brought forward. When news of the arrest became public, people who had followed the case may have felt the strange stillness that comes after long uncertainty breaks. It is not always a feeling of movement. Sometimes it is a pause. A person hears the name and sits down. A family member reads the article twice. A retired investigator may see the headline and remember the first file. The past does not rush in. It settles. That settling is part of why we tell the story slowly. A fast retelling would miss the way a cold case answer lands. It lands on people who have lived entire chapters of life since the beginning. It lands on a police department whose personnel may have changed completely. It lands on a community that may barely remember the original case except through older residents or archived articles. The Mckinley case's answer arrived late enough to belong to more than one generation. Generations change the meaning of memory. A child who was small when Tonya died became an adult long before the arrest. Younger relatives may have known her through stories rather than direct memory. Investigators in 2020 may have been studying a file older than their careers. The case became something handed down, not in a formal ceremony, but through photographs, reports, and repeated questions. You can feel that handing down in the weight of the folder. Handing down is not always neat. Some details become clearer with documentation. Others blur because people are human. Families may remember different parts of a person. Investigators may emphasize different parts of a timeline. Public accounts may simplify. The file becomes the place where the record tries to remain steady amid all that human shifting. In the Mckinley case, the DNA evidence became one of the steadier parts because it could be tested and compared when other forms of memory had grown fragile. Fragility is not failure. It is simply the nature of time. A witness who once remembered a face clearly may later remember only a feeling. A detective who once knew every street in the case may later need the old map. A family story may preserve love more accurately than sequence. In cold case work, investigators learn to respect memory without leaning on it beyond what it can bear. The Mckinley solution rested on evidence that could bear more of the load. The scientific evidence, however, still needed human interpretation. A lab result does not walk itself into court. It must be explained, connected, and placed in context. Investigators have to understand what the result means and what it does not mean. Prosecutors have to prepare experts. Defense attorneys have the right to question the methods. This is the sober architecture around any forensic result. And in an old case, the architecture becomes even more important. Because Wells died before trial, much of that courtroom explanation never occurred publicly. The case reached an arrest, but not the full adversarial testing of a trial. This gives the story its particular shape. It is not an unsolved case in the old sense, because investigators identified and charged a suspect. It is not a fully tried case either, because no jury verdict came. You can let that shape remain as it is, neither flattened nor exaggerated. In the calm room of the narration, that shape feels like a file, with one section thinner than expected. The investigative section has grown thick. The genealogy section has its notes and reports. The arrest section is present. The trial section does not expand the way it might have. There is an empty space where motions, testimony, and a verdict might have been. The empty space is not a cliff. It is part of the real record. Real records often contain such spaces. A missing witness, a lost opportunity, a suspect who dies before court, a question no one can answer. The discipline of respectful storytelling is to leave those spaces visible without filling them with invention. We do not know every thought, every reason, every private conversation. We know the path the investigation took and the answer it reached. That is enough to continue. The path invites us back to Pensacola, not to replay anything sharply, but to remember the setting as more than a name in a report. Pensacola is a coastal city with humid air, old neighborhoods, military presence, working streets, churches, bars, homes, and the slow rhythms of Gulf Coast life. In January, the air may carry a cool softness, especially at night. Streetlights reflect on damp pavement. Sound can travel differently in mild winter air. That was the world around Tonya's case. A place matters in an investigation because people move through places in patterns. They take familiar roads. They stop where they usually stop. They are seen by people who know the same corners and parking lots. In 1985, detectives would have understood that geography through physical presence, not only through maps. They would have driven routes, stood near locations, and tried to imagine how time and distance worked on the night in question. You can feel the city becoming a page in the file. Later, investigators may have studied that same geography from a different distance. Streets may have changed. Businesses may have closed. Buildings may have been replaced. What was familiar in 1985 may have become archival by 2020. A cold case detective, looking backward, has to reconstruct not only events, but the world in which those events occurred. That reconstruction can require maps, old directories, photographs, and the memories of people who still recall the earlier city. The Mckinley case, then, was tied not only to evidence, but to historical place. The old Pensacola of the file had to be understood well enough for the modern case to make sense. Where people lived, where they worked, where they might have met or crossed paths, whether Wells could be placed in the relevant area, whether his life in that period aligned with the case. These questions belong to the ordinary geography of proof. Ordinary geography has sensory edges. The heat stored in pavement even after sunset, the salt faintly present in the air, the roughness of a wooden porch rail, the sound of a screen door closing behind someone, the smell of gasoline near a roadside stop. These are not clues by themselves, but they help you remain inside the world the file describes. A case is never only dates. It happens in weather, light, distance, and texture. For sleep, we move through those textures softly. We do not sharpen them into danger. We let them ground the mind. You are the detective with the file open, not someone being pulled into a scene. You are safe at the desk, reading slowly, noticing what the original investigators had to notice. A street name is not a jolt. It is a place on a map. A date is not a drumbeat. It is an anchor. The date anchors us to early January of 1985. The year matters because it defines the tools available. No modern genealogical database. No routine forensic genetic genealogy. No instant digital mapping on a phone. Investigators relied on interviews, physical evidence, local knowledge, and the forensic methods of their time. You can picture a case board or a desk spread with papers, perhaps a telephone cord curling beside a notebook, and a detective writing a name by hand. By 2020, the same case could be approached through a very different set of tools. Digital records, advanced DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, easier communication between agencies and laboratories. But the new tools did not erase the old facts. They depended on them. The date from 1985 and the profile from the old evidence had to be joined to the newer search. The case was an act of time travel, but a disciplined one. Disciplined time travel is what cold case detectives do. They enter an older moment through documents, then return to the present with questions modern tools can address. They do not pretend to stand in the past completely. They know the past is partial, but they can read it carefully enough to ask, what survives? What can be tested? What can be checked? What can be known now that could not be known then? The Mckinley case answered one of those questions through DNA. You can imagine the old evidence as a sealed message. For years, investigators knew it might matter, but they could not fully read it. The message remained in custody, moving only as procedures required. Later, DNA testing began to open it. Later still, genealogy gave it an address in a human family tree. Finally, the confirmatory comparison attached it to Wells. A sealed message had become a named lead. This metaphor should stay gentle, because evidence is not mystical. It does not choose when to speak. People make it speak by applying careful methods. But the feeling of an old sample becoming newly readable can be profound. It reminds us that the past is not always gone in every way. Sometimes the past leaves material behind, and if that material is protected, the future may learn from it. Protection is not glamorous. It is storage temperature, packaging, inventory, policy, and respect for chain of custody. It is the kind of work that rarely appears in a headline, yet without protection, the Mckinley case might have remained unanswered. A mislabeled item, a discarded sample, or a broken chain could have weakened the entire path. Instead, enough remained for investigators to proceed. That is a quiet triumph of procedure. Procedure can sound dry, but in old cases, it can be an expression of care. When someone follows evidence rules, they are caring for the future integrity of the case. When someone writes a report clearly, they are caring for the person who may read it years later. When someone stores an item properly, they are caring for a family that may not receive answers until long after the first investigation. In the Mckinley case, procedure became a form of long-distance compassion. You can let that idea settle. Long-distance compassion. It may describe much of cold case work. The person doing the careful task may never meet the family who benefits from it. The benefit may not arrive for decades. The worker may not even know which task will matter most. Still, the task is done properly. Somewhere later, another person finds the record usable, and the chain continues. The Mckinley chain continued until 2020, when the arrest of Wells gave the case a public development after years of quiet. The year itself now feels historical in its own way, marked by upheaval far beyond this case. Yet inside that unsettled year, an old Pensacola investigation moved forward. That contrast is worth noticing gently. Even when the wider world is noisy, the work of old files can continue in small rooms, with people reading, testing, and calling. A cold case breakthrough during a noisy year may feel almost hidden. News moves quickly, attention scatters, but for the family and investigators, the development is not small because the world is distracted. It is the result of decades. It carries Tonya's name back into public view. It says that what happened in 1985 was still being taken seriously. You can imagine that message arriving with a weight no news cycle can measure. Public attention, when it returns, can be double-edged. It may honor the case and inform the community. It may also simplify or compress a family's pain. The calm way to receive it is to separate the necessary facts from the noise. The fact of the arrest, the fact of the DNA link, the fact of genetic genealogy, the fact of Wells's death before trial. These facts give the case its outline. They are enough for respectful attention. As a detective reviewing the file, you may also think about the officers who were not there to see the breakthrough. Cold cases often outlast careers. Someone who worked the first days may have retired long before genetic genealogy emerged. Another person may have kept a copy of the case in memory, but never known the final name. The eventual solution belongs partly to them too, because their early work preserved the ground. The file becomes a place where careers overlap without meeting. That overlap can be seen in handwriting, initials, and report styles. Older documents may use language or formatting that feels different from later ones. Some pages may be typed with uneven ink. Others may be crisp digital printouts. The contrast tells you the case has lived through more than one administrative era. You can run your eyes over those pages and feel time not as an idea, but as changes in paper, font, and form. The Mckinley case had to remain coherent across those changes. A modern investigator had to understand what an older report meant. A lab had to understand what evidence was collected and how. A prosecutor had to connect the old and new records into one explainable case. This is not always easy. Old files can be incomplete, difficult to read, or organized according to habits no longer used. The fact that the case moved forward suggests that enough coherence survived. Coherence is another quiet virtue. It is the difference between a box of papers and a usable record. It allows someone new to enter the work without starting from nothing. In cold case units, creating coherence can be a task by itself. Files are reorganized, scanned, indexed, and summarized. Evidence is matched to reports. Missing items are traced. This groundwork may happen long before any lab result, but it prepares the way. You can imagine a detective spending hours simply making the Mckinley file readable for a modern review. Pages spread across a desk, sticky notes marking names, copies made of fading documents, old terms translated into current understanding. The work may feel administrative, but it is investigative in its own right. It helps the case become available to fresh analysis. Without readable structure, even good evidence can be hard to use. Once the structure is clear, the questions can become sharper. Is there biological evidence? Has it been tested with current methods? Does a profile exist? Is it eligible for genealogical research? What legal permissions are required? Which lab can do the work? How will any lead be confirmed? These questions move the file from memory toward action. The Mckinley case must have passed through some form of this careful sequence. Before Wells was named, each question has its own waiting period. Waiting for approval, waiting for testing, waiting for analysis, waiting for a genealogy report, waiting for confirmatory comparison, waiting for prosecutors, waiting for arrest. The public may see only the final movement, but the investigators live through each pause. A cold case can be a long series of pauses, interrupted by brief moments of direction. The patience is in staying attentive during the pauses. Attentiveness is not the same as excitement. It is quieter and more durable. It means checking email for a lab update without expecting a miracle every hour. It means reading one more record when the family tree does not yet resolve. It means asking a colleague to look at the same branch to avoid error. It means keeping the family informed when possible, while not offering certainty too early. In the Mckinley case, attentiveness carried the work through to identification. When the genealogy narrowed, the investigator's attention likely became more focused. A name that fits the DNA and the known circumstances changes the atmosphere of a case. The room may still be quiet, but the quality of the quiet shifts. People speak more carefully. Documents are reviewed more deliberately. The possibility of arrest brings responsibility into sharper relief. You can imagine the file lying open while someone reads the same paragraph twice, making sure nothing is being assumed too quickly. Assumption is the enemy of old cases. It can enter through memory, through public rumor, or even through the excitement of a promising lead. Patient detectives resist it. They ask what the evidence actually shows. They ask what still needs confirmation. They ask whether alternative explanations have been considered. In Tonya Mckinley's case, the direct DNA comparison with Wells was the step that moved the lead beyond assumption. It gave the investigation its firmer ground. Firmer ground does not mean every question disappears. It means the central allegation can stand. That distinction matters because it lets us speak accurately. The DNA evidence linked Wells to the case, and authorities charged him. Because he died before trial, the allegation was never tested to verdict. We can respect the investigative solution and still acknowledge the legal incompleteness. This is not uncertainty for its own sake. It is care with language. Care with language is part of care for people. A family hearing about an old case should not have to sort through exaggeration. Investigators should not be turned into dramatic figures. A suspect should not be discussed beyond the evidence. Tonya should not be reduced to the manner of her death. The calm approach keeps the human beings intact. It lets the facts be serious without becoming sensational. That is why we do not dwell on harm. We dwell on investigation, preservation, and patience. We dwell on the people who kept asking what could still be known. We dwell on the science that finally narrowed the file. We dwell on the family's weight, because that is where the emotional truth of a cold case often rests. The Mckinley case can be told fully enough without sharpness. Its weight is already present. Weight, in this story, is measured in years. It is measured in the decades between the first report and the arrest. It is measured in the technological distance between early forensic work and genetic genealogy. It is measured in the family's private endurance. It is measured in the thickness of the file and the chain of custody that kept the evidence meaningful. The weight is not something to lift quickly. It is something to hold carefully for a while. So we hold it. We hold the early Pensacola streets. We hold the evidence box. We hold the lab report. We hold the genealogy chart. We hold the cigarette sample and the comparison. We hold the arrest in 2020. We hold the fact that Wells died before trial. We hold Tonya's name at the center. We do not need to arrange these things into a final pronouncement yet. We keep reading. As we keep reading, we can think about what it means for a case to be at last solved after such a long delay. The phrase "at last" carries relief, but also fatigue. It suggests that many people had been waiting for a door to open. In the Mckinley case, at last did not mean easy peace. It meant the investigation could finally say who the evidence identified. It meant the file had moved from unanswered to named. That movement matters, even when it arrives late. Late answers arrive with shadows attached. They bring information, but they also remind everyone of how long the information was missing. They may raise questions about what life would have been like if the answer had come sooner. They may bring back public attention that feels both welcome and tiring. A family may be grateful and exhausted in the same hour. The calm voice leaves room for that complexity. You can imagine the day after the arrest announcement. The headlines have been read, calls may have been made. The file is still there. The evidence has not changed. The past has not changed, but the official understanding has. Somewhere, someone may have slept differently that night, not because everything was healed, but because one long-standing unknown had a name. That is a small and significant shift. In cold cases, small shifts can carry great meaning. A new test result, a confirmed identity, a corrected timeline, a suspect named, a family notified. These shifts do not restore what was lost, but they change the burden of not knowing. The Mckinley case's shift was substantial because it touched the central question. The person authorities believed responsible was no longer hidden behind time. Time had hidden him in ordinary life. That is often the unsettling truth of solved cold cases. A person can live many years while evidence waits quietly in a file. The gap between past action and later identification can be immense. We do not need to imagine Wells's life in detail. It is enough to recognize that the investigation eventually reached across that gap and attached his name to the preserved evidence. The reach across time depended on public records as well as biological science. Genealogy is built from both. DNA suggests relationships, but records give those relationships names and places. A match becomes a family line because someone reads documents. A possible suspect emerges because dates and locations fit. This combination of biology and paperwork is one reason the method feels so suited to cold cases. It joins the intimate and the archival. The intimate is the genetic material, the biological trace connected to a person. The archival is the paper trail of families and public life. In the Mckinley case, those two forms met. The preserved evidence held the intimate trace. The genealogy work followed the archival trail. The confirmatory sample joined the two more directly. The result was not just data. It was an identification that changed the case record. You can sit with the carefulness required to prevent that process from becoming too broad. Investigators using genetic genealogy must follow policies, obtain approvals, and respect limits. They must avoid treating distant relatives as anything more than leads in an ancestry search. They must confirm before accusing. In an old case with a grieving family, the temptation to move quickly could be strong. But careful movement protects the case and the people around it, protects the truth from being overstated. The Mckinley case, viewed softly, is a long story of protection finally becoming identification. Identification is not the end of emotional work. After a suspect is named, people may begin asking different questions. Who was he? Did he know Tonya? Could anyone have known? What was missed? What would a trial have shown? Because Wells died before trial, some of those questions may never have received public answers. This is another reason the case remains contemplative rather than neat. It offers a major answer, and then it leaves some smaller rooms closed. Closed rooms are common in history. We do not enter them by force. We acknowledge the door, note what the record does and does not say, and continue through the rooms that are open. The open rooms in the Mckinley case are enough to show the patient path. Initial investigation, preservation, cold case review, DNA testing, genetic genealogy, confirmatory sample, arrest and the halt before trial. Each room has its own light. The room of initial investigation is warmer and more chaotic. People are speaking, remembering, trying to help. The room of preservation is cooler, orderly, almost silent. The room of DNA testing is bright and controlled. The room of genealogy is filled with names, branches, and records. The room of arrest is formal and heavy. The room after Wells's death is quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. The case has changed. You can move through these rooms at a slow pace, and the movement itself becomes the narration. No need for a heading. No need for a sharp turn. The file guides you. When the old paper speaks of first interviews, you listen there. When the lab report appears, you listen there. When the genealogy chart unfolds, you follow its lines. When the legal record stops short of trial, you let that stillness remain visible. Somewhere in the middle of the file, perhaps there is a point where older pages and newer pages meet. That meeting point is where cold case work feels most alive. It is not in the first shock of an event, and not in a final line, but in the moment a person from the present reaches into the past with a tool the past did not have. The Mckinley case reached that point when investigators used modern genealogy to revisit preserved evidence. The phrase preserved evidence can sound neutral, but it carries a moral undertone. Preserved for what? Preserved for whom? In this case, preserved for Tonya, preserved for her family, preserved for a future investigator. Preserved for what? Preserved for whom? In this case, preserved for Tonya, preserved for her family, preserved for a future investigator. It is earned by treating the victim as a person and the family as more than recipients of information. It is earned by continuing the work after public attention fades. In a long investigation, trust is built almost invisibly. Invisibility is part of the cold case world. Much of the work is never seen by the public. The hours spent reading old reports, the searches that lead nowhere, the genealogy branches that collapse, the lab inquiries that do not produce usable results, the evidence inventories that reveal nothing new. These efforts may leave little trace beyond notes, but they are part of the process. The Mckinley solution sits on top of visible and invisible labor alike. Invisible labor can be hard to honor because it lacks a clear moment. Yet it may be the reason the clear moment becomes possible. Someone had to decide to keep going before the breakthrough justified the decision. Someone had to spend time on the file before it had new momentum. Someone had to believe that an old case was still worth resources. That belief, translated into work, is one of the quiet strengths in Tonya's case. The cold case detective's desk may look ordinary during such work. A computer monitor, a stack of files, a coffee cup with a worn rim, a yellow legal pad, maybe a family photograph nearby reminding the detective that life outside the office continues. The Mckinley folder lies open among other folders, each with its own story. The detective reads slowly, perhaps tracing a line of text with one finger. making sure the next step is grounded. Grounding keeps the work from floating into speculation. It returns every theory to the record. Does the evidence support this? Does the timeline allow it? Does the DNA confirm it? Does the law permit the next step? In sleep narration, grounding also keeps the listener safe. You are not being pushed into fear. You are sitting with careful thought. The file is serious, but the room is calm. The room may be imagined as late evening now. The lamp throws a circle of warm light over the desk. Outside, the house or office is quiet. The old case file is open, and the pages nearest you describe a breakthrough that arrived long after the first investigators could have expected it. You breathe slowly. You turn a page. The Mckinley case remains steady beneath your attention, and the story continues through the details that patience made readable. One detail worth lingering over is how genetic genealogy changes the meaning of a cold case lead. In older investigations, a lead might come from a witness, an informant, a fingerprint, or a direct database hit. Genetic genealogy can produce a lead that is more like a direction on a map. It may point toward a family network rather than a person. It asks investigators to travel carefully from ancestry to identity. That travel is slow by design. The genealogist may begin with matches who appear distant from the unknown profile. Those matches are not dramatic. They may share only enough DNA to suggest a relationship several generations back. From there, the genealogist identifies common ancestors, builds descendant lines, and looks for intersections that fit the unknown person. It is methodical work, and it requires patience with uncertainty. In the Mckinley case, the method ultimately pointed toward Wells, but the pointing had to be earned. Earned is the right word because every branch must be supported. A tree copied from another person's research may contain errors. A record may refer to a different person with the same name. A family story may be incomplete. A surname may be misspelled in one document and corrected in another. The genealogist must verify, compare, and revise. You can imagine quiet concentration, the glow of records on a screen, and the soft scratch of a pencil beside a keyboard. When the family line narrows, geography becomes important again. A possible person must not only fit the genetic pattern, but also the case context. Age, location, and access matter. If a candidate was nowhere near Pensacola, the branch may need rethinking. If a candidate fits the place and period, the lead grows stronger. In Tonya Mckinley's case, Wells became the focus because the genetic and contextual pieces aligned enough for direct confirmation. The confirmation step has an almost old-fashioned feel, despite the science. Investigators still needed something from the person himself. The discarded cigarette provided that. It is a reminder that modern cold case work can involve both advanced genealogy and ordinary surveillance or collection. The high and low technologies meet. A family tree built through digital records leads to a small physical object, and that object leads back to the laboratory. The laboratory then performs its careful comparison. No raised voices, no sudden music, just procedure. The sample is processed, the profile is compared, the result is reviewed, a report is written. You can picture the report emerging from a printer, warm for a moment, then cooling on the tray. Someone picks it up, reads it, and understands that the Mckinley case has crossed a threshold. Crossing a threshold in an investigation can be quiet enough that no one outside the room knows it happened. The door is metaphorical, the work continues, but the case is no longer the same. Once Wells was linked to the evidence, the old uncertainty changed. Investigators had a suspect supported by DNA. The file had moved into a new category. The next steps would be legal, practical, and deeply human. Legal steps require a different tone. Evidence becomes probable cause. Reports become affidavits. A person becomes a defendant. The case moves toward a courtroom where rules are formal and every claim must be supported. You can imagine the language becoming more exact, less conversational. Dates, names, and test results are placed in order. The system prepares to hear an old story in a present-day room. But the courtroom process never fully arrived. Wells's death in custody left the case without trial. This fact is not something to dwell on sharply, but it cannot be ignored. It shaped the final public record. It meant Tonya's family did not hear the evidence presented in a full proceeding. It meant investigators' work identified a suspect, but a jury never rendered a verdict. The file's later pages carry that quiet limitation. Limitations are part of every honest retelling. They do not weaken the story when they are stated carefully. They make the story trustworthy. In the Mckinley case, the limitation is clear. The investigation identified and charged Wells, but he died before trial. That means the case was solved by investigators, in the sense that they named the person the evidence led them to, while the court process ended before final judgment. The distinction is gentle, but important. You can imagine a listener, half asleep, hearing that and understanding enough. The answer came. The trial did not. The family had a name. Some questions remained. The tone stays low, because nothing here needs to be forced. The truth is already weighty. We let it rest in the room, beside the old folders and the soft light. The Mckinley case also offers a quiet view of how science and memory cooperate. Science provided the link to Wells, but memory preserved Tonya's significance. Without memory, a cold case can become only an old technical problem. Without science, memory may remain painful but unanswered. Together, in this case, they produced something more complete than either could alone. The file became both a scientific record and a human remembrance. Remembrance is not the same as resolution. It does not close a case by itself, but it keeps the person at the center. When investigators return to an old file, they are often motivated not by abstract curiosity, but by the knowledge that someone was left without answers. Tonya's family kept living with that absence. The department kept the file. The evidence kept its information. These forms of remembrance aligned when the case was reopened. Reopening a case can be an act of humility. It says the earlier investigation did not reach the answer, and it asks whether something now available might help. It does not necessarily criticize the past. It recognizes that time has changed the tools. In the Mckinley case, reopening meant allowing the evidence to be read in a new way. That new reading did what the older methods could not. The older methods were not useless. They established the foundation. They preserved the evidence. They created the record. They held the case in official memory. The newer methods built on that foundation. This layered view is more accurate and more respectful than imagining a single breakthrough floating by itself. The DNA result was not detached from the original investigation. It was the original investigation continuing through a later instrument. That continuity is what makes the case feel so patient. It was not a restart from nothing. It was a return. You can hear the difference. A restart is abrupt. A return is careful. A return says, "We have been here before, but we can look again." A return says, "The file has waited, and we now have a better question." The Mckinley case was solved through return after return, until the right question finally found its answer. The right question by 2020 was not only who might have known Tonya or who had been mentioned in old interviews. It was whose DNA was preserved in the evidence, and whether that DNA could be identified through genealogy and confirmed. That question did not exist in useful form in 1985. The case had to wait for it. The waiting was painful, but the eventual question was powerful. Powerful questions must still be asked gently. Genetic genealogy can feel invasive if treated carelessly. It reaches into family connections that may include many people far removed from the case. Investigators must handle that reach with policy and restraint. The Mckinley investigation, like other genealogy-assisted cases, depended on the principle that relatives can guide a search without being burdened by suspicion. The proof must return to the individual. The proof returned to Wells through the comparison sample. That return is the ethical and investigative hinge. It moves the case from family inference to individual connection. Without it, the genealogy would have remained a lead. With it, investigators had the link they needed. You can see the hinge in the file as a point where everything before begins to align with everything after. There may have been a moment when the detective reviewing the report felt the long years condense. 1985, all the cold years, the modern testing, the genealogy search, and the cigarette sample, all held together by one result. The feeling would not need to be loud. It may have been a quiet breath, a phone call to a supervisor, a careful note added to the case. Big changes in old files often begin as small movements. Small movements accumulate. A page is added, a call is made, a warrant is prepared, an arrest is planned, a family is notified, a press statement is written. The case steps forward. Each movement is practical, yet each one carries emotional force because of the years behind it. In the Mckinley case, the practical and emotional were tightly bound. The practical work produced the answer the emotional life of the case had needed. You can imagine the family notification as one of the most delicate moments. However it happened, it would have required care. Authorities had to convey that a suspect had been identified and arrested, while also explaining what the evidence showed. The family would hear the name Wells and attach it to decades of unanswered grief. Such news does not land cleanly. It spreads through memory, through old questions, through the sudden need to understand a stranger's name. A stranger's name can become heavy very quickly. Before the identification, Wells may have meant nothing to many people connected to Tonya. Afterward, his name became part of her case forever. That is one of the strange burdens of cold case resolution. It gives a family a name they needed, but not necessarily a name they wanted to carry. The file carries it too, because the evidence led there. As we continue, we keep Tonya's name closer. Wells appears because the investigation identified him, but Tonya remains the reason the story is being told. You can think of the file as arranged around her, with each investigative tool pointing back toward the question of what happened to her and who was responsible. The case was not solved for the sake of solving. It was solved because a person mattered. The sensory world of the file helps keep that personhood present. Old photographs, worn reports, soft paper, the cool air of storage, the hush of the lab, the coastal dampness of Pensacola. These details slow the mind and keep the story grounded. They also remind us that the case moved through material reality. Nothing here is abstract if you look closely enough. Even a DNA profile begins with something physical, collected and kept. Collected and kept. Those words are simple, and they describe the first mercy the future received from the past. Someone collected what mattered. Someone kept it. The later solution began there. It may not have felt like mercy at the time. It may have felt like routine. But routine, when performed carefully, can become mercy after decades. The Mckinley case is proof of that quiet transformation. There is a lesson in that for any old file. Routine matters. Labels matter. Storage matters. Reports matter. The ordinary work done on a hard day can become the reason a family receives an answer 35 years later. You do not have to make that thought grand. It is already enough. In the circle of lamplight, the ordinary becomes worthy of attention. Attention itself may be the deepest theme. The case needed attention when it was new. It needed attention when it seemed stalled. It needed attention when it seemed stalled. It needed attention when new testing became possible. It needed attention when the legal process began. Each return of attention was like adding a little warmth to a cold room. Not enough at first, perhaps, but eventually enough to change the air. The air in the imagined archive changes slowly. At first, the Mckinley box is one among many. Then someone selects it. The lid is lifted. The papers shift. Dust rises faintly in the light. The file is read again. A new question is written down. That simple act, opening the box, is where many cold case breakthroughs begin. Not with certainty, but with willingness. Willingness can be institutional or personal. A department must be willing to allocate time. A detective must be willing to sit with old uncertainty. A lab must be willing to evaluate aged evidence. A genealogist must be willing to untangle complex family lines. A prosecutor must be willing to consider a case with old witnesses and modern science. The Mckinley case required all of these forms of willingness before the arrest could happen. You can feel how many people stand behind the final result, even if only a few names are public. This is not unusual. Most investigations are collective. Cold cases especially depend on quiet contributors. The person who finds the evidence box. The person who scans the old report. The person who answers a records request. The person who notices a family tree error. The person who confirms a date. Their work may never be central in a retelling, but it belongs to the outcome. Belonging is a soft word, and it suits the case. Every careful act belongs. Every preserved page belongs. Every respectful limitation belongs. Even the unanswered parts belong, because they keep the story honest. In the Mckinley case, the known and unknown sit together, like pages of different thickness in the same file. You turn them slowly, letting each page have its weight. The known includes the DNA breakthrough. The unknown may include private details never recorded publicly, or questions that could have been explored at trial if Wells had lived. We do not force those unknowns open. We keep to the path. The case was reopened. Evidence was tested. Genealogy was used. Wells was identified and arrested, and the legal process stopped before verdict. That is the path the record allows us to walk. Walking that path, you may notice how quietly revolutionary genetic genealogy has been for cold cases. It does not replace the old virtues. It rewards them. Evidence that was kept well becomes useful. Records that were preserved become navigable. Family histories that were documented become searchable. The method depends on the survival of many things, not only DNA. It is modern, but it thrives on archives. In that sense, the Mckinley case is an archive story as much as a forensic one. The answer came from biological evidence, yes, but also from stored records, public documents, family histories, and police files. The archive is not a dusty backdrop. It is an active participant. It holds the past in forms the present can use. You can almost hear the archive breathing when the file opens and the old pages meet new questions. Of course, archives are imperfect. Some records are missing. Some details were never written down. Some memories cannot be recovered. The Mckinley case was solved despite those limits because the crucial evidence survived and the necessary records were sufficient. Other cases may not be so fortunate. That awareness should make us careful, not discouraged. It shows why preservation matters before anyone knows which detail will later prove essential. Essential details are often humble. A date, a storage location, a sample number, a relative's name in an obituary, a discarded cigarette. None of these has the shape of a grand clue until the investigation connects it to the right question. The Mckinley case is full of such humble importance. It invites you to lower your gaze from the dramatic to the practical, where the real work happened. The practical world has its own calm beauty, clean labels, ordered shelves, notes written clearly, a family tree checked twice, a lab report filed in the correct place, a timeline revised after a new fact. These things are not decorative, but they are beautiful in the sense that care is beautiful. They show human beings trying to be accurate in the presence of grief. That is a tender kind of discipline. Tender discipline may describe the best cold case work. It does not grow hard in order to face hard facts. It becomes careful. It speaks plainly. It avoids promises it cannot keep. It honors the victim's life. It acknowledges the family's weight. It respects the accused person's legal status. It lets science carry what science can carry, and leaves the rest to documented fact. The Mckinley case benefits from that kind of telling. As the file remains open, we can return once more to the moment when the old evidence became newly useful. Imagine the sealed package leaving storage for testing, accompanied by documentation. The movement would have been formal, perhaps unremarkable to anyone nearby. Yet within it was the possibility of changing a decades-old case. The package may have passed through hands, vehicles, intake procedures, and lab systems. Each step had to preserve its meaning. Meaning in evidence is not only physical, it is relational. An item matters because it is connected to a case, a scene, a date, and a person. Break the connection, and the item loses force. Preserve the connection, and decades later, it may still speak. The Mckinley evidence kept its relationship to Tonya's case long enough for the DNA to be interpreted. That relational integrity is one of the quiet pillars of the solution. Once the lab developed or confirmed a usable profile, the investigation could ask whether it matched anyone directly. When direct searches did not provide the needed immediate answer, genealogy offered another path. This is a common pattern in recent cold case work. Traditional forensic databases are powerful, but they depend on prior inclusion. Genetic genealogy reaches differently, through relatives and ancestry. It can identify someone who has never been entered into an offender database, provided the family connections can be traced. That reach is why the method has solved cases once considered stubbornly resistant. But the reach must be matched by care. In the Mckinley case, the genealogical work led to Wells, but investigators still obtained a direct sample for confirmation. This sequence matters enough to repeat softly. Genealogy pointed, direct testing confirmed, then authorities acted. It is a calm sequence and a responsible one. Responsibility is the thread running through the later case. Responsible use of old evidence, responsible interpretation of genetic matches, responsible legal action, responsible public communication. When cases are old and emotions are strong, responsibility keeps the process from becoming untethered. It keeps the answer rooted in proof. It keeps the story from turning into rumor. The Mckinley case reached an answer through that rooted process. Rootedness matters because cold cases can attract speculation. Years of silence leave room for theories, some sincere, some careless. A strong DNA-based identification can cut through much of that speculation, but it should not invite new speculation beyond the record. We stay with what is known. Wells was identified through genetic genealogy and DNA comparison. He was arrested. He died before trial. Tonya's case was no longer without a named suspect. The rest, where unsupported, remains quiet. Quiet is not emptiness. It is respect for the boundary between fact and imagination. In a bedtime retelling, quiet also gives the listener space to rest. The mind can follow the file without being startled. The case is serious, but the cadence is soft. You turn another page. You hear the paper. You see the dates. You let the investigation move at its true speed, which is slow, cumulative, and patient. Patient cases often teach patience to the people who study them. You learn not to demand the answer before the evidence is ready. You learn to value small procedural acts. You learn to hold grief and method in the same room. You learn that some truths arrive without every explanation attached. The Mckinley case teaches all of that, and it does so without needing to raise its voice. If you were to trace the emotional line of the file, it might begin in shock, move into effort, then uncertainty, then long endurance, then cautious hope, then identification, then an incomplete legal ending. That line is not smooth. It bends, it pauses, it doubles back, but it does move. The Mckinley case did not remain exactly where it was in 1985. The file traveled, and the travel mattered. The travel was measured not in miles, though there were surely miles driven by investigators, but in methods. From interviews to forensic preservation, from preservation to DNA profiling, from profiling to genealogy, from genealogy to direct confirmation, from confirmation to arrest. Each method carried the case a little farther. The whole journey took decades because the later methods had to be invented, accepted, and applied. Applied is an important word. Tools do not solve cases by existing. They solve cases when people recognize where they may help and then use them well. Genetic genealogy existed as an investigative possibility before every old case benefited from it. Someone had to choose the Mckinley case for that kind of work. Someone had to move it from shelf to lab to genealogist. That choice is part of the solution. Choice also appears in how we tell the story. We choose not to center fear. We choose not to dwell on harm. We choose to center patience, evidence, and Tonya's humanity. We choose to let Wells's name appear only where the investigation requires it. We choose to keep the unknowns quiet. These choices make the retelling more faithful to the kind of care the case itself required. The room is very still now, in the imagined late hour. The lamp is low, and the file has spread across the desk in several small stacks. One stack holds the early investigation. Another holds forensic records. Another holds genealogy and the final lead. Another holds the legal outcome. You know the stacks belong together because Tonya's name runs through all of them. Her name is the thread that keeps the pages from becoming separate stories. Threads can be fragile, but this one held. It held through public quiet. It held through technological change. It held through departmental transitions. It held until the evidence could be read and the genealogy could be traced. In the Mckinley case, the thread led to Wells, and the investigation followed it as far as the law and circumstance allowed. That is the measure of the solved file we are sitting with. Still, as you look over the stacks, you may feel the difference between an answer and peace. An answer is information. Peace is something more private, and no case file can guarantee it. The family may have received an answer that mattered deeply, while still carrying grief and unanswered questions. Investigators may have felt satisfaction in the work and disappointment that trial never came. The file can record the answer, but peace belongs to people. Because peace cannot be forced, the narration does not try to provide it. It offers calm instead. Calm is not the same as closure. Calm is a way of sitting honestly with what is known, without pressing the story into a shape it does not have. The Mckinley case can rest in that calm for now. The page turns, the light holds steady, and the next detail waits in its proper place. That next detail is not new evidence, but the meaning of delay in a case solved by modern science. Delay can make a case feel forgotten, yet the Mckinley case shows that a file can remain structurally alive even when visible movement is rare. The evidence stayed, the records stayed, the questions stayed. When the method arrived, the case could respond. That is not the same as constant progress, but it is not abandonment either. Abandonment would have meant the loss of the evidence, the disappearance of the record, the failure to look again. Instead, the case was held long enough to be revisited. Holding is an active verb here. It means custody, attention, and institutional memory. It means enough care to prevent final disappearance. In the long life of the Mckinley file, holding made solving possible. You can hear the word holding in the body as well. holding a photograph, holding a family in mind, holding uncertainty without distorting it, holding the line between suspicion and proof, holding the evidence until the right test exists. Cold case work is full of holding. It is not dramatic, but it is strong. The Mckinley case was held for decades, and eventually, holding became knowing. Knowing came late, and it came through a scientific pathway that would have seemed impossible at the beginning. Yet once it arrived, it made a kind of retrospective sense. The evidence had always contained information. The family tree had always existed in the background of human relationships. The records had always been scattered across public life. The new method simply connected them in a way earlier investigators could not. This is one of the contemplative comforts of such cases. The answer was not invented by the new method. It was uncovered. The truth, or at least a crucial part of it, had been there in material form, waiting for interpretation. That does not make the years easier, but it gives the investigation a sense of continuity. The old file was not empty, it was unread in one essential way. Unread evidence is a quiet idea. It suggests a book closed, not because no one cares, but because the language has not yet been learned. In 1985, investigators could read some parts of Tonya's case. They could read witness accounts, physical circumstances, and local timelines. They could not yet read the DNA in the way later science would allow. The book was partly closed. In 2020, another section opened. When that section opened, the story did not become a bedtime tale in the ordinary sense. It remained a real case with real sorrow. But it did become something that can be told softly, because the emphasis is not on fear. The emphasis is on human persistence, on evidence preserved, on science used carefully, on the dignity of returning to a name after many quiet years. Tonya Mckinley's case can be held in that gentle frame. The frame widens a little when we consider the broader wave of cases helped by forensic genealogy. Across different states and decades, old files have begun to move because biological evidence could be linked to family trees. Each case is unique, but the pattern is familiar. A preserved sample, a profile, a genealogy search, a narrowed suspect pool, a direct confirmation, a family notified. The Mckinley case fits within that pattern while retaining its own place and person. Patterns help investigators decide what to try next. If one old case can be solved this way, another might be eligible. Departments begin reviewing evidence with fresh questions. Families hear about new methods and ask whether their loved one's case could be considered. Labs develop specialized workflows. Policies evolve. The solution of one case becomes part of the atmosphere around others. Tonya's case, therefore, may have helped strengthen the quiet confidence that old evidence deserves another look. Confidence must still be modest. Not every sample will work. Not every profile will produce useful matches. Not every genealogy search will narrow enough. Not every suspect will be alive. Not every case will have sufficient legal path after identification. The Mckinley case had the necessary combination, but many files do not. Modest confidence keeps hope humane. It lets investigators try without promising what cannot be promised. Humane hope is gentle with families. It says there may be a method worth exploring. It does not say, this will be solved. It says the evidence deserves review. It does not say, an answer is guaranteed. In the Mckinley case, the method did produce an answer, but the path there was still careful and uncertain until confirmation arrived. That uncertainty should be remembered because it honors the real work. Real work is often slower than public storytelling. A headline can compress 35 years into a few words. A script like this slows the words back down. It lets the years expand. It lets the evidence room be quiet. It lets the genealogy chart take shape branch by branch. It lets the families waiting remain visible. It lets the arrest and the absence of trial sit side by side. The slower version is closer to the truth of the case. Truth in cold cases is rarely only factual. It is also temporal. The timing matters. The fact that the answer arrived after decades is part of the answer's meaning. If Wells had been identified immediately, the story would be different. Because he was identified in 2020, the story includes preservation, technological change, and long waiting. The Mckinley case is inseparable from its delay. Delay can create a sense of distance, but careful narration can bring the file close without making it harsh. You can feel the paper, you can hear the lab printer, you can see the family tree widening, you can imagine Pensacola's winter air, you can sit with the detective who opens the folder again. These details bring the case close enough to understand, but not so sharply that the listener is disturbed. The listener, tonight, is not being asked to solve anything. You are simply reviewing the solved path, slowly. You are the quiet detective after the fact, seeing how one page led to the next. The case has already moved. The evidence has already spoken as far as it could. You can follow the movement without pressure. If your eyes grow heavy, the file will wait. It waited for decades. It can wait a little longer. That thought itself belongs to the rhythm of the story. The file waits. The detective returns. The evidence remains. The method improves. The question is asked again. The answer arrives late. The courtroom path stops short. The family carries what it can. The file remains as a record. We move through these ideas slowly, not as a list, but as a tide, coming in and going out around the same quiet shore. The shore of this story is Tonya's name. Every time the narrative drifts toward procedure, her name brings it back. Tonya Etheridge Mckinley, a young mother in Pensacola, a case opened in 1985, a family waiting beyond the edge of the official reports, a file preserved until genetic genealogy could help. That name keeps the story from becoming only a demonstration of forensic progress. Forensic progress is still important. It shows what can happen when science and careful records meet. It gives cold case units new possibilities. It helps correct the old belief that some cases are simply beyond reach forever. But progress without remembrance can become too clean. The Mckinley case asks us to keep progress and remembrance together, one hand on the lab report, one hand on the photograph. The photograph, in this imagined file, has softened corners. Perhaps it has been copied many times. Perhaps the original stayed with family, while investigators kept a reproduction. The image carries more than data. It carries a life before the case. When you look at it, the years between 1985 and 2020 feel less like an abstract span and more like time taken from a specific person and those who loved her. The lab report, by contrast, is precise and unsentimental. It does not know grief. It knows comparison. It knows whether profiles match. It knows statistical meaning. This precision is valuable because grief deserves more than feeling. It deserves proof. In the Mckinley case, the proof came through DNA, and that proof gave investigators the ability to name Wells. The photograph and the lab report belong together because each supplies what the other cannot. Together, they form the fuller human record. One says, "Here was a person." The other says, "Here is what the evidence shows." A cold case needs both. Without the person, the evidence loses moral center. Without the evidence, the moral need may remain unanswered. Tonya's case became answerable when the evidence found its modern voice. But it remained meaningful because of the person at the center. You can rest with that for a moment, as though the 2 pages lie side by side on the desk. The photograph catches the lamplight differently from the report. One surface is slightly glossy. The other is matte. One draws the eye toward a face. The other draws it toward language and numbers that we would speak only in words. Both are quiet. Both matter. From here, The file continues into the official aftermath of the arrest. Though not toward a trial, there may be booking records, court entries, statements, and later documentation of Wells's death. Those pages are part of the case, but they do not replace the investigative achievement. They simply shape how the achievement could be carried forward. The case had reached a name, and then the legal path narrowed unexpectedly. Narrowed paths are familiar in cold case work. A lead narrows, a family tree narrows, a courtroom path may narrow or close. Investigators learn to keep walking where the path remains available. After Wells died, the available path was no longer prosecution to verdict. It was documentation, communication, and the official recognition of what the investigation had found. That may have been less than some hoped for, but it was more than the silence that came before. Silence before an answer can feel endless. Silence after an answer feels different. It may be calmer, or heavier, or simply more defined. In the Mckinley case, the silence after Wells's death held a named suspect and a DNA link, but not a trial record. You can sense how the room changes. The file is no longer cold in the same way, yet it does not have the full warmth of courtroom resolution. It rests in between. In between is an honest place for many real stories. Not unsolved, not fully tried, not unanswered, not entirely explained. The Mckinley case occupies that in-between space, and the narration should be comfortable enough to stay there. We do not force it into a clearer category than reality permits. We let it be a solved cold case with a complicated legal ending, and we keep our attention on the patient work that made the solution possible. Patient work is still the thread. It led from the early investigation to the evidence room, from the evidence room to the lab, from the lab to genealogy, from genealogy to Wells, and from Wells to the arrest. That thread does not break because the trial never happened. It simply ends in a different place than expected. The file records that difference, and we read it softly. Softly, too, we can consider the role of public acknowledgement. When law enforcement announces the solution of a cold case, it is not only informing the public, it is also saying that the person at the center has not been erased. The announcement returns the name to community memory. It may reach people who knew Tonya, people who remember the case faintly, or people who had never heard of it before. Public acknowledgement gives the old file a voice beyond the archive. But public acknowledgement is brief compared with private memory. A press conference lasts minutes. An article is read and set aside. A family's memory continues afterward, in quieter rooms. The Mckinley case's public solution was important, but the private meaning likely extended far beyond it. You can imagine the news settling into conversations, into old recollections, into the long work of understanding what it means to know after so much time. Understanding may come in waves. At first, there is the factual recognition. A suspect has been named. Then there may be emotional recognition. The years of waiting have changed shape. Later, there may be practical recognition. The trial will not happen because Wells is dead. Each wave has its own feeling. A family may move through them slowly, and not in any neat order. The file cannot describe all of that, but a compassionate retelling can leave space for it. Space is part of gentleness. We leave space around the unanswered questions. We leave space around the investigators who worked for years without certainty. We leave space around the investigators who worked for years without certainty. We leave space around the old evidence that finally spoke. The script breathes there, because breathing is how a difficult story becomes bearable at bedtime. The breathing rhythm returns us to sentence and page. You turn another page. The paper shifts. The lamp remains steady. Outside the imagined room, the night is quiet, and the case continues to unfold in the only way old cases can, slowly, with the past and present lying together on the desk. The Mckinley case has more to teach about patience, and we stay with it, calmly, while the next part of the file waits beneath your hand. By the end, the Mckinley case did not remain in the same silence that held it for so many years. Investigators identified Daniel Leonard Wells through preserved DNA evidence and genetic genealogy, and he was arrested in 2020 in connection with Tonya Etheridge Mckinley's case. He died in custody before a trial could take place. So there was no jury verdict, no courtroom testimony carried all the way through, and no final judgment spoken in that formal way. Still, the case was solved in the investigative sense, because the evidence that had waited since 1985 finally led authorities to the man they believed responsible. You can let that distinction rest gently, because old files often close in uneven ways. Some answers come with courtrooms, and some come through laboratory pages, family trees, and the careful work of people who kept asking a question long after the first urgency had faded. In Tonya's case, the answer came late, and it came with a quiet incompleteness, but it came because the evidence was preserved, because the file was not forgotten, and because the patient methods of a later time reached back toward a young woman whose name still mattered. And now the room can grow softer around the file, the lamp is low, the paper has settled, and the years no longer need to be held so tightly in your hands. Tonya's name remains where it belongs, not lost inside the weight of procedure, but resting at the center of the record. The question that once had no name was given one at last, and the parts that could never be fully spoken in court can stay quiet now, without being chased through the night. So we leave the Mckinley file in its calm place, with the old evidence honored, the long work acknowledged, and the remaining silence allowed to be silence. The answer came as far as it could, after years of waiting, and tonight nothing more is asked of you. The papers can rest, the room can darken, and the story can finally go still.